Robin,
Yes.
how are you?
Fine. How about you?
Good, good. I'm good. How long time no see? How are you?
Really? I think we were talking last week.
Oh, we were? I'm sorry.
No, I don't know. Oh, time fly, isn't it? You don't know what day.
I know, I know. I'm
So
glad.
many things going on.
I'm so happy to see you. But for our Pacific War, part three,
Yes,
and
very interesting.
in 2 weeks is going to be part four, and then
Yes,
we have a lot of good things coming up. Next week we
yes.
have Thermopylae, which is a Greece versus Persia war, number
I
two.
see.
Did you see the first one on the recording from last week?
No, normally I don't like to see recording. Should I? Yeah,
Oh man,
okay.
it was amazing. It was amazing. I mean,
Really?
it was
So I would say Persian War is next Saturday, right?
yes, but there's a recording from the first one because if you want
Oh,
to really like understand the second one, you need to listen to the first one because they kind of working together.
yes. Would you be posting again?
Where it is, where
Yeah,
it's yeah, sure.
YouTube, right? But
Yeah, I'll
if
show it. I will post it right now on chat. Let me
yes,
post it right
thank
now.
you.
Of course, anything for you. Mr. Joe is here. How are you,
Okay.
Joe? Hey, how are you?
Fine, how you doing?
Our resident expert. How are you? Good, good.
No
Everything okay, my
expert.
friend?
Everything's good.
Good, good. So the weather is kind of nice, right? For the
It's
Yeah,
really
it's
nice.
warm
Yeah.
up, isn't it?
yeah. Yeah. You know what's weird? It's telling me to admit people. I thought the people just should go through. I understand why it's telling me to admit people. I mean, it's nice at the same time, but it's like ridiculous. The Zoom should just let people through. I guess it created a room for some reason. Maybe because I was setting it up through
No,
my
I think it's
computer.
good that you accept them. Did I tell you in one group last month,
What?
somebody crashed in and chat put up very bad wording, you
Oh,
know.
yeah, 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 yeah. So who was
Yeah.
that?
So no, I mean it's so so later on the host has to block and then admit, you know. But sometimes you don't know when they sign up, you don't know who they are, right?
Yeah,
They
we had
come in.
one guy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
very strange. I
we
mean,
had one guy, Jerome. He kept popping up in all my meetups,
yeah.
and he really, what is it? Mission of Paraguay, Stephanie Gonzalez.
What
Okay,
is that?
I don't know,
What
somebody from.
happened? Somebody what try follow you and try to do something?
Yeah, he was going to all my meetups. I have run three, and he doesn't know, like, he doesn't know anything about stocks. He doesn't know anything about history, and
Uh,
he had an argument with somebody here about Bible, and then he also had an argument with me on a stock presentation, and I'm like, I don't like to argue people during the
yeah,
my
yeah.
presentation, and he's like an older gentleman, so I wasn't really, I wasn't trying to but then after a while I was like, Jerome, I mean, you seem like you have an agenda, you just want to ruin all my
What did he
presentations.
say? Or you did you just
I
block him?
when I told him I'm not going to admit you anymore, and he sneaked into one of my presentations, and then I told him, listen, I'm not going to admit you anymore, and then he goes to me, why, right in the middle, and I gave control to the other host,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
he didn't know how to stop him,
Block.
so we
Yeah,
had a
yeah.
conversation for like 5 minutes. He was asking me, why do I block him? I said, you cursed one of my resident stock investor on my podcast, so I understand why you did that. And he cursed him out. I was like, I can't understand that. And the guy was like game about it. It was like, oh, he was just laughing it out. But it's not nice. People shouldn't be subjecting to any of that stuff. So it was. So I had to block him. I got rid of him on all my groups, and finally figured out how to do it. I don't like blocking people, but he was just a distraction. John is here. James is here. How are you, John? I'm sorry to give you such a short notice for Wednesday, but
Okay.
you don't need to special presentation. You just need a map and then we'll talk it out on the rise of Hitler. So,
What do you mean by map?
I mean, you know, like
It's something,
maybe not a map, maybe like biology. Yeah, yeah,
I'll put some
biology.
themes down, yeah.
Yeah, like a biology. You know, where he's from, and maybe you know where he served. Maybe a map where he served. I don't know.
Okay, yeah, that's
I don't
true.
know. I don't know a lot about his service, where he served, and but you know, the last time you spoke about it. Um, so Aaron is here, Rachel is here, Mark is here, and we have a new person, Stephanie. Um, Aaron, would you
Hey.
like me to pass the control to you?
Yes, please. That'd be great. Let me just.
You got it, my friend. All right, and I will post the
Part one,
the
Persian
YouTube
War, right?
YouTube
No?
yeah YouTube channel.
Yeah.
One
So
second.
it's homework for anyone who didn't join you on part one, right?
Yeah, but because you can't really
Yeah, I appreciate
completely
it. Yeah.
grasp the second Greek War until you watch the first one.
Okay.
I know maybe people disagree and they stand in. Aaron, you're a host now. Aaron, I'm just press. It's recording already, so you don't have to record it.
Okay. Okay. Cool. That's what I was
Oh,
figuring out. Quick thing. I was going to ask you. You sent me an email on. Did you get that recording or no? There's a problem on the recording that you had.
So the problem is that it's unconverted file. A Zoom unconverted file doesn't let me convert it in my computer.
So we can talk after if you want and just kind
Yeah,
of.
we can talk about. So anyway, to new people that's here, everybody knows Aaron already, but Aaron is our host presenter, so to speak. Loves history, and he's presenting regarding the Pacific. He's our specialist in Pacific War. Today we're doing part 3, and I'll let him talk about it today. So go ahead, Aaron.
Absolutely. Let me just get my deck up and
Sure.
we'll get the show on the road. All right. Just let me know if everyone can see and B hear me. Okay.
Yeah, we can see. It looks good.
good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. And so, hopefully for everybody that hasn't been coming to these, you should know that, this is just fun and it's not, advanced grad school lectures. So, step in and, ask questions and, and challenge and sort of all the above. So, so anyways, this is part 3. We've done 2 parts already. And Zach has uploaded the first 2. So if you're interested, in the other parts, you can watch them. I'll try to do kind of a little bit of a summary with us. I mean, there's enough of us here. And so this is sort of what I'm looking to cover today, which is basically a summary review, the U.S. foreign policy from 20 to 40, which sort of sets the ball in motion. And that's sort of the larger context here is that in essence, these were sort of 2, or not, these like there's some, foreign or kind of aliens, but the United States and Japan were really on this collision course post World War I. And even if it wasn't.
Aaron, one more thing. I apologize to stop you.
Sure,
For some reason, the Zoom won't let people through directly. You have to admit them, just in case you get a pop-up window, because you're.
It'll come up. It'll give me a pop-up though, right?
It will tell you, yeah. Or if not, then I really don't know where you could see where to admit people into the Zoom.
Yeah. So let me ask you this quick question: will the pop-up be over here, like you guys can see my screen of you of each other?
Yeah, it would be on top. It would be on top where you see.
Here. It'll be up here.
Aaron, viewing the screen and top.
Okay, cool. So I can minimize this, and it'll be just up here that I'll get a request.
I think you also need to check once in a while, like maybe 10 minutes into it, check if anybody's in the waiting room.
Where does it show me the waiting room here?
don't understand why he did that. Maybe it's a new procedure for them.
So it doesn't show me the waiting room?
He would say that people are waiting on the waiting room, a place
Oh.
that meet them.
Okay, so there's not like a separate tab for waiting room. It's just, it will just.
Zoom is doing this because they've gotten all sorts of criticisms about their security policy.
Sure.
So they're tightening up. Zach, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
Isn't it possible for you to continue to be the person who's running the meeting and just have other people present their screen?
Yeah.
That you don't have to give up as so, because I know from when I was presenting, if you get distracted by other things happening, it's really, discombobulating. It'd be really great if you could maintain the control and feel that stuff, and the presenter could just present his screen and not have to worry about the administration.
Yeah. I'll figure it out.
Figure that out. I mean, if we want, we could demo that and figure that out after.
Because I know that you still get an icon to share your screen, even if you're not the presenter.
Yeah. So if you want, Zach, we can, after this, we could kind of go over it and then maybe do a demo this week or something where we sort of
sure
get that nailed down, and everybody else going forward can sort of have that approach. That's a great.
I mean, I know when I gave my presentation and there was somebody didn't have their phone muted, it's like what happens, that's the last thing that you want to have to worry about.
Sure. So, okay, cool. So we'll work on that. And then, so anybody that is new to either this series, which this turned into a series, right? It was never going to be one session, but everyone really liked what we were going through with, this larger context of what became known as the war in the Pacific, which is bigger than what most people on average believe, until they kind of drill into it, which is sort of some stuff happened with Japan and China, and they invaded, and then Japan hit Pearl Harbor, and then we had the Allen campaign, and then the atomic bombs, and then that's it, right? That's sort of the junior high version of what most people on average, unless they're really into it or they have a historical or cultural background, are generally aware of. So everybody was really fired up to sort of keep going and really drilling into the weeds here. So, and this is your weeds. So if we're too far in the weeds, push out, if you want to go further, we'll go into the dirt. I mean, it's totally.
Aaron, let me stop you. There's people in the waiting room. I apologize.
So wait, where I don't
go to settings. Hold on. This is what it says.
Oh wait, waiting up here. No, I see it up here under.
Yeah, click
so,
on waiting, open, and and let people in.
Okay, so what I have, it's interesting. So if I can, everyone can see my screen, right? Including this bar up here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. If for whatever reason the participants one turns red, like it just did, just remind me, and then I'll just go up and do it. Because if for some reason I don't pay attention, and because I'm in the topic, then I might miss it. But that's sort of obvious now that this turns red when someone's waiting. So does everyone see that?
Yeah, I see.
Okay, cool. All right, good. So those are the so this is the goal today, is to go into U.S. foreign policy. So every time I bold something, that's the section obviously we're working on. Then we'll go to the U.S. naval readiness. This sort of matters. It's sort of, I had this way to think about this, which is, do I kind of go, context switching? Do I kind of go back and forth, and that sometimes can drive people crazy, and it's just a lot of material? Or do I kind of stick on, sort of what's the U.S. point of view and context and situation, and all the way from the political and foreign policy all the way down into the naval and military strategy in the Pacific, and then what's the Japanese version of that? And so I kind of took that approach, and my goal was to sort of split that in half today, as I'm getting kind of more organized about this, because it just is quite a bit of material, and it's all contextual, right? Like, you can't leave out the readiness of the U.S. Navy or not, or the Japanese Navy and not. I mean, it's sort of fundamental to the whole war in the Pacific, right? That would be the equivalent of leaving out land forces in discussing European war and conflict and strategy in the Second World War. So that's why I sort of organized it like this. And then if Richard's here, as per our joke, we will be getting to Pearl Harbor. It will happen. So a couple things I wanted to do is just set the context ahead of time. Which, the U.S. Had taken over the Philippines as part of the resolution of the Spanish-American War. And taken over is sort of a loose term, and we talked about this in the prior couple parts. The U.S. was a very lightweight, opportunistic, imperial power in the Pacific. It basically needed basing rights, and it didn't have really commitments beyond that when it came to its ability to project power, right? It wasn't looking to, fully integrate, a state-based policy. It wasn't trying to make the Philippines, which back then I guess we were 46 states or something like that, right? It wasn't trying to make it the 47th state. So it doesn't mean that it wasn't a colonial policy. It just means that it was very different than the European model, which the European model was really this continuous extension of, the prior 300-400 years, which, we talked about to some degree.
Aaron, sorry. So the interest was only logistics, the place where it was, and
well, yeah, but and if you remember when we talked about the Mahanian, Alfred Thayer Mahan's strategy, which really became kind of the complete standard Sentinel strategy that almost everybody was using, or at least cherry picking, having logistical basing for navies, and for the U.S. being a two-ocean navy as a strategy, it doesn't minimize it, right? It says that the Philippines were really central. I mean, one of the things that you sort of realize, and I even had this problem and succumbed to it, is because Pearl Harbor was such a shocking kind of military, political, kind of strategic, it really was, 9/11 like, or 9/11 was Pearl Harbor like. We sort of overweigh the fact that Hawaii was what was strategic in the Pacific. And in reality, the Philippines are what was strategic in the Pacific. Our Navy just happened to be, in essence, forward projected into Hawaii. And so that made it a lucrative and convenient and sort of tasty target for the Japanese. But the Philippines were what was absolutely strategic, because if you kind of look at the map, and this is sort of, like most maps, sort of semi-crude here, you see where the resources are, and we'll get into that a little later, but, basically oil, tin, rubber, I mean, just, fundamental, you kind of call it like resources 1.0, were all basically, either Indochina, Dutch East Indies, Southern Philippines, Malay, et cetera, and Japan's up here. And so the fact that the U.S. could, in essence, block, Japan getting to all these resources made the Philippines absolutely, really fundamentally strategic. In a weird way, it's almost, in this context, like Poland, right? It's this like embargo land in between, Germany or the West and Russia. And obviously somebody has to have either control of that or enormous influence there. And in the U.S. case, because the U.S. had a lot of resources already and had established ties for decades with the Dutch and these were all trading companies too, right? The big thing they were kind of like state-owned enterprises, like the way China has today, maybe a third or half of its economy. But they still were, sort of self-interested trading companies, which sort of fit the U.S. approach, right? The U.S. liked working with that type of model, to be honest, because there's just it's highly transactional, and as long as you sort of don't do anything crazy or stupid, you just keep the transactions flowing. And so the U.S. could have its Philippine position, you know, with really let's call it a decent sized standing army, but not massive, and then all the basing rights through the Pacific, and then keep all that vital trade coming back to the U.S. in natural resources. And of course, that's what Japan wanted. So, so hopefully that does that answer your question? Or
Very much, thank you.
sure.
Before you go on, can I mention suggest that you, before you YouTube it, you change England to Britain, because you might have some tilted Scots and Welsh choirs
Yes.
after you.
Yeah, absolutely. Scots. You're right. That's well, eventually they'll all have their own independence, which is probably a really good thing long term. But yes, I'll definitely change that. Thanks, though. So what was and thanks for bringing that up, because France and what was defined as England then really had this. It was a pretty interesting dynamic. They didn't fight kinetically directly, right? You didn't have French troops shooting at English troops. It wasn't 1648. But there was, all these sort of proxy entities, state-owned enterprise type structures, right? Sort of monopoly companies, almost the equivalent of what you'd call, private military contractors. I mean, it had sort of this, it was almost like a bad TV movie, where you just had this sort of mess in this region, but that made it also difficult to conquer. And we'll get to that later. But that was the sort of the lay of the land that the Japanese sort of, looked at. And I'm sure everybody knows, FDR was the president. I think one thing we forget quite a bit is, number one, that the political process in the late 20s and early 30s, in terms of time and in terms of how long transitions occurred, and then also how significant the Great Depression was, not just, in the United States, but all over the world, that you really didn't have what you'd call an incredibly activated sort of foreign policy of FDR, really going until, 33, 34, because he wasn't inaugurated. Back then you didn't come in January 20th, so you still were on that sort of Lincoln timeframe, which was March. And so you just had a lot more delay than I think people sort of, consider. It's almost like most people believe, the Great Depression, the crash happened in 29, and then sort of FDR started fixing things right after. And it's like, no, the crash happened basically, a year into Hoover's term, really. And you had 3 more years of Hoover's term. And in some ways more because of the transition. And then you obviously had this, period of a transition and policy change, and then ramping up. And so, in a lot of ways, you really didn't see this significant shift until 34, 35. And that's a huge window of time when quite a bit was going on in the world, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, a lot of the dies were already cast, whether in Japan, Germany, Russia kind of cast 2 dies, one Stalin basically, Stalinizing things, and then the second one, I would say, sort of getting ready for World War II. But you had all these major dies cast, and really the United States was sort of just this outside actor when almost all this was going on. And I think that's, it's one of the reasons I really wanted to focus on this piece right here, to kind of understand on the United States side, but then also, we'll get to the Japanese side, what were these internal tensions that existed, and you basically had an interventionism which was, let's call it the pre-multilateral or the grandparents of the multilateral order. They had a lot of, most of them were Wilsonian, and for any of you that studied foreign policy or at least taken a few classes in IR or read a book or two, there's this sort of history of internationalism in the United States that's sort of bracketed into these large figures, whether it's, Jeffersonian, Hamilton, Wilsonian, et cetera. So the interventionist, they really wanted the League of Nations, the LON, to sort of succeed. They really couldn't see why everyone else couldn't see why it was so essential and effective. And they tended to be buoyed by some degree of business interests, which happened all over the world. The interesting thing about the business interests in the United States when it came to sort of our internationalism, especially then in the 20s and 30s, is that they were completely transactional, right? I mean, there were just a handful of people that were bankers, or a handful of sort of, let's call them more strategic thinkers, that saw this larger arc of, let's say America being able to project economic power and using foreign policy to do it. Most of them wanted, based on their industry needs or their industry interests, to secure X, Y, or Z. I mean, that's really what it boiled down to. And that gave them, in a weird way, a very overestimated sort of social and media presence, but a very weak presence in terms of the levers of power. And then on the other side, there was, which of course you could say, times don't change that much. And I don't think they do in all of history when it comes to things like this. You had basically a disarmament side that basically viewed war as, given what we went through in World War I, and the United States, while having a important presence, didn't really bear the brunt of more than, let's say, 10% probably of the effects of the war. But even that was so massive. And in some ways it was almost a hangover from the Civil War, but just at a far more sophisticated and kind of kinetic level, right? And, basically destructive level. And so this disarmament, which was really the majority, right? That was probably closer to 75%. They were either isolationists, they were nativists. There was a very strong anti-war movement. It's kind of funny. There were people in the late 60s who were a lot older, people who were, 60s, 70s, 80s, who used to sort of make fun of the 1960s anti-war movement, not make fun of it because it's not important, but in how sophisticated they thought people in the 60s thought they were, given how anti-war people were in the United States in the 20s, really in the teens even, during World War I. People don't realize there was not this sort of 80-20 support for going into World War I. So this was this continuation that just sort of amplified from the 1910s. And so by the 1930s, we were really an isolationist nativism was a sub piece to it, but very strong anti-war. And then you had what were defined by those terms as conservative Republicans, which were different than today's in about 50% of policies. They basically, and this is sort of a sub piece that I just really discovered, is a lot of what you would call in the United States, if you're aware of sort of how our suburbs are, or let's say our pockets that are more purple, politically. Even though our red and blue is different than England or the UK or many other places. But most of those seats were basically Republican seats back then. And a lot of it came out of the Civil War. And so World War I had a disproportionate effect on those populations, meaning their sons and fathers and uncles and brothers fought. This was just a variant of the scale of the population, especially in the more developed northern states and Midwestern states. And so,
I mentioned, Aaron, that
Yep.
in the same vein, people may not realize the history of the Democratic Party.
absolutely, that's a very good point, right?
Okay,
So
so I'll let you
yeah,
do
yeah. So that's a great point. I can, and I'll finish up with that piece here. But so the Democratic Party, it's almost like you could swap the parties today in a weird way. Not quite, but let's say 75% is probably about right, or 60 to 80%, somewhere in there. And so the history of the Democratic Party was, it was in essence the majority Southern party, going back, really 100 years at that point. And the Republican Party, which came out of the Free Soil Party, was basically an anti-slavery party. And so you had these sort of tensions locked in that really never changed too much after the Civil War. And so given that the fact that there were, 4, 5, 6 times as many people living in what you'd call northern Midwestern states, or maybe more than that, maybe 5 or 8 times as many, probably 5 or 8 times as many as it lived in the South, World War I just hammered these sort of new, let's call them suburban, Republican districts. I mean, the amount of, the death toll was something they really hadn't seen since the Civil War. So you just had all this was funneling in to basically say to anybody that looked at the world as saying, we should intervene, as saying you're insane. I mean, it was just like, there was just zero political support for that. And so that governs an enormous amount of how we sort of thought. And so famous isolationists, so Senator Henry Cabot Lodge was a very famous Massachusetts Republican senator. He was really sort of fundamental to blocking the League of Nations, the Treaty of Versailles. He did not want, and he had enormous support for this idea of, let's just say, interlocking balance of power that in some ways locks you back into a World War I-like structure just globally, where if X invades Y, Z has to defend. And, and these weren't sort of reactionary people, right? I mean, most of them were pretty intelligent and I would say reasonably rational about that in the context of that era. And then politically, it would have been just suicide if they did. I mean, it would have all been voted out, easily. People did not want to go through a Civil War, World War I-like conflict again. And they didn't see the value in it. They didn't see, and the big thing to recognize is the way we've sort of globalized the last, say 75, 85 years, where at least most people, whether they believe in some military or not, or they believe in some economic or not, or they just take advantage of it by going to the grocery store or buying stuff online or whatever, when they get a pair of tennis shoes, most people sort of embed a lot of globalism in their life, whether they want to or not, or agree with it. That was not the world we lived in, 100 years ago. It was just the people just didn't. I mean, there was a tiny population that you'd call basically elites that enjoyed those fruits and labors. That was starting to increase because of middle classing that started happening. So you started having novelty and sort of taste change, but that was not 50, 70, 80% of people in the United States.
Aaron.
Yep.
Oh, I was just going to say, on your prior slide, where you had the contrast, which I think is a good one, the interventionism and the disarmament.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I think I would almost make that internationalism
Yep.
versus isolationism.
Yep.
Because most of the business interests and the Wilsonians, I think that they would have argued they wanted those international organizations in order to procure peace, not opportunities for intervention. And the business interests, they were looking to expand supply chains, and the bankers were all looking to expand their financial transaction scope. So, you could have,
the anti-war, you know, and I think the isolationists were isolationists not only just in terms of let's not get involved in any foreign altercations, but they were, let's, in terms of trade, let's have tariffs, you know, things of that nature. So
Yeah.
just a
No,
point, but
yeah, no, you bring up a great point. I mean, one of the reasons I sort of structured it this way is I sort of did the voice of the customer, any of you that work in the corporate world, but you know, it's what was the American that was just the regular human being thinking, right? And in their world, they viewed it as you intervene or, you know, you basically don't have war or any kind of engagement to create war. But from a policy perspective, you're completely right. It is much more about, you know, being an internationalist and an isolationist. The one thing I would say too that is really important to kind of understand is that independent of, you know, kind of what we think are these huge cleavages we have now, you know, most people, you know, unless there's some extreme reasons, if you get another opportunity to get a job and it makes sense for your family and just everybody around you, you'll move to Philadelphia, right, from New York. Unless there's some, you know, real animus that you have about it, or you'll move from, you know, Maryland to Ohio or whatever. The world that we were in 100 years ago, it wasn't just that people were isolationist in, you know, in this sort of intellectual way where, oh, you know, I can tell you all the different, you know, parts of the UK empire, you know, of the English empire. You know, I could name all the states. I could name all the capitals. Most Americans were highly provincial, you know, in a strange way, very much like many people were in the world. But, you know, you could draw an analogy for a long time, and in some cases, maybe even today, just my experience is when you get to the French countryside, there's quite a bit of provincialism. It's not as intense as maybe 20 or 30 years ago when I first started, you know, going there. But you recognize that, oh, like I recognize this. This is, you know, the difference between people in North Carolina from, you know, Kentucky or Tennessee or West Virginia, where back then you would have people that would say, why are you here? You're from Ohio. You know, it wasn't just, oh, you're just an American. I mean, you know, most of the time you could get there. But the point is there was enormous sort of localism that was still very fundamental. I mean, you know, go ahead, please.
Aaron, well, how would you describe that anti-war movement? I mean, most people, you look at that and you think anti-war means from a left point of view.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's true at that time. So what was the anti-war movement?
I mean, so I think one thing is I think a lot of our politics that we experienced, and I don't think anyone here is over 80, so most of us weren't adults in 1960, but most of our politics is defined, I believe today, by you know, continuous cleavages from really the 1960s going forward. That doesn't mean everything started there. It just means that things sort of got sorted out by political party and by sort of belief system and moral system, on and on and on. We were not like that 100 years ago, right? People had these incredibly incompatible sort of political, social, moral, and geographic beliefs that sort of got grafted on to, in many cases, very local, very state party definitions, right? So you had a very, by today's standards, liberal Republican Party in Massachusetts. You know, you could probably say it's the equivalent of the California, of the Democratic Party in California. That's probably a modern analogy. It's probably not too far off. And then you had a different one in Ohio. That didn't mean they didn't share maybe at least 50 or 60% of policies, maybe big ones especially, but it wasn't this sort of it wasn't this linear, aligned, you know, very sorted, you know, world. And so I think what's important about seeing people who are anti-war is the first way you were anti-war is either someone you knew or someone, or someone close to you was impacted by World War I. Whether it was a brother, an uncle, your best friend, a husband, wife's, a child, whatever. And so there was a very large, and you have to recognize this was folded in to the suffrage movement and folded into prohibition. There's a couple fantastic books. One, maybe next year we could do something on this. It's really fascinating. When you,
is there a religious association that binds?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's not one, but yes, there's definitely a
American,
component. Yeah, there's a
abolitionist tradition.
Yeah, definitely. No, and that's a perfect way to view it. There was definitely a moralism to it. It wasn't quite crusade level, but it was, and I don't mean 1,000 years ago crusade. I mean, the U.S. Last couple hundred years. It wasn't really quite that delineated, but it definitely had a very strong Protestant and evangelical component to it. Not what you call evangelical today, but basically spiritualism coming out of the 19th century. And then of course you had people who were impacted directly. You had the explosion of the suffrage movement, prohibition, which was tied into it. It was really, I mean, if I really want to simplify it, it was a bunch of people that said, a bunch of guys create a bunch of problems and we want to not have those anymore. And so we want to keep things really simple. And, and of course this applied across the board, right? We want people to be kind of good, upstanding human beings, right? We don't want people to be violent. We want people to be decent to each other. We don't want to have to, fight for everything here or abroad. I mean, it was in a strange way, sort of Wilsonian, but at a social moral level almost, right? It was idealistic in terms of the moral and social capital.
Yeah. There was also the protos, especially among the what we might call the Northeast establishment elite, certain groups who were proto-socialists.
Yes, absolutely.
And they were they didn't change their mind about war until Hitler came into power.
Oh, that's
and then
true.
They were in a kind of an embarrassing position of going from, and since they were elites, they were people who had contacts in the Washington policymaker circles. They were like, no war, no war, no war, and then all of a sudden it was like, yeah, let's go to war.
Well, no, you bring up a great point, because even amongst what we would maybe define as socialists, because there were communists, like we're talking red and whites from what was going on in Russia in the revolution. And then you had sort of, let's call it socialism 1.0, basically democratic socialism, right? It wasn't the degree of state power, or let's call it the evil of the Maximus state power. It was still state power, but it was not with maximum force. It was more of social movements. So you had, 3, 4, 5 different movements on the far left that were definitely, most of them were anti-interventionists to some significant degree or completely. So you're right, that was and they split in intellectual lines and don't forget ethnic lines, because you had an enormous amount of migration from across Europe that really exploded, right? I mean, it was on par to the same migration that in the United States we've had the last 4 decades or so, from basically Mexico and Central America in the United States, right? I mean, it really, and especially when you look at the regionality of it, right? It really penetrated, whether it was the Northeast, whether it was the Midwest, and it sort of wrapped itself around a lot of the social politics, which then impacted this, right? Because most people did not want to leave places that treated them really badly, typically through a lot of really bad activities, hurting them, warfare, you know, the equivalent of pogroms, whatever, to come somewhere to then turn around and want to go back and fight, right? That most people weren't trying to sign up for that deal. And so this was this feedback loop that you really had, which, you know, so that obviously, you know, I picked Henry Cabot Lodge because he was one of the, let's call him like, you know, sort of leaders, right? There was dozens, I mean, really hundreds of politicians, right? This was not you know, a really complicated position to have, right? It would almost be the equivalent of being, you know, pro high school graduation, right? I mean, being an American isolationist in the 20s and 30s was sort of mom and apple pie. And so we talked before, and I don't, you know, for those of you that that want to learn more about it, if you go to prior presentations, we definitely spent some decent time on the disarmament conference, you know, which really boiled down to trying to create this naval balance around the world through large capital ship restrictions, and then try to control, because if you did that, you sort of restricted the projection of power that you could have, right? The range, you know, you couldn't be in half a dozen different places if you only had, you know, 8 to 15 capital ships. It was unsustainable. So that was the theory, which, you know, you could argue it worked for the period it worked in. And that's sort of the position I've learned to take. It makes more sense. I mean, I think it's one thing, it's really easy to be relativistic about what happened out of World War I as saying, oh, well, all the things we tried, we somehow couldn't stop World War II. Just like thinking that the fact that we reduced the intensity that would likely have just instantly built right back up for at least a decade or so was by itself sort of a win at that point. And we were trying these things out, right? I mean, in some ways, this was not the first time in history that anybody tried to have a single treaty, but the scale of the treaties and the scale of the conferences, you know, I mean, you could take modern foreign policy people and bring them to all of these events, and they could jump in. I mean, this wasn't, you know, the end of the English Civil War or French, you know, English wars, you know, or the Holy Roman Wars, where you had these, you know, really almost unreadable treaties, you know, that were almost put together by monks. You know, this was modern foreign policy. You know, obviously didn't have all, you know, they had phones, right? They had really, the only thing they didn't have was really internet. I mean, if you're going to be honest about it. I mean, they actively communicated, they wired every room. The spying behind all of this stuff in the 20s is pretty fascinating. So, and we talked about the 5-power treaty, which, you know, sets all these ratios up, which of course, Japan felt that was an affront because they felt they were an equal and they deserved, you know, to have their position sort of defined that way. What governed this was a combination of, this had something to do with the ratio of commitment in World War I. This also had something to do with obviously the side you were on, and it also had to do with the balance of power, right? And so the U.S., especially coming out of or going into the 5-power treaty, did not want to put Japan on balance with the U.S. That was really, if you want to get to our core aim, was to isolate Japan's naval development. We viewed them as the same threat they viewed us, you know, the way they viewed us as a threat. And they, of course, they viewed the Soviet Union as a threat. I mean, you know, they viewed sort of any large power that was in their sphere as a direct threat. So now there was a loophole, which was there was no restrictions on small ships and on innovation in ships, right? They couldn't imagine the concept of an aircraft carrier. I mean, there were some people with ideas, but it would be like bringing up the concept of a tank in 1905. You know, there were some people putting some funky things together, but most people wouldn't believe that, 15 years later, you'd have tanks that, running around. That wasn't, the way that they viewed the world. So the U.S. was, had an enormous amount of a debt. And by the way, do not underestimate, which I did, the impact that this had on our social politics too, right? The idea that we just didn't go and fight and die in England and in France, or I'm sorry, not in England, but in France mostly, and let's say around the German border, but we lent them a ton of money, and they can't pay us all back, and it just, everyone looked at this as like, these are European messes. Why are we involved in this? This is why we, quote unquote, came over here. I mean, that was the sort of very simple worldview, which once again wasn't that irrational when you look at the scale of the relationships that we had with all those countries, and also recognize, as soon as the war ended, all those countries went right back to sort of their, risk board game theory, right? And they were, sort of, it's almost like they didn't, I mean, why would they? They didn't change their behavior. So, we would just see what they were doing. We lent them a ton of money, and we kept lending them money. And there was this huge disconnect. It's actually, when you really dig into it, remarkable that by the late 20s, we only got Hoover and FDR as presidents. And I would say Hoover is a little more rehabilitatable than I think people give him credit. I mean, he obviously wasn't an all-time world-class president, but he was always put in the bottom 1 to 5, and he's definitely not that. I mean, and the more you sort of study him, you recognize he was just, and you can almost say no one was maybe equipped for what hit us in 28, 29, 30, 31. But the fact that we got Hoover and FDR, I think in historical terms is pretty fortunate, because we probably could have gotten far scarier presidents back then, and not just presidents, but people who, and if you looked at people who ran against, FDR later, I mean, it was, whether it was Lindbergh or, I mean, we wound up having some pretty, extreme characters that believed, either we should cut deals with everybody to stay away from everything, or we should just walk away from everything. I mean, that was sort of the simple view. And hyperinflation, which, by the way, that just didn't affect Germany, right? It affected countries around the world that had enormous supply and demand shocks off of what was going on in Germany, because Germany was a pretty big country, and the effects of inflation across Europe, sort of continued through the 1920s. I mean, we were isolated, so we actually didn't have huge effects. If anything, we wound up sort of having a little bit of a disinflationary effect, because we lent so much money to Europeans because they had so much inflation, right? I mean, it was almost like Argentina on steroids during all the Argentinian crises, if any of you remember, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even today sometimes, where, they basically default on their debt every, 5 to 10 years. You had billion-dollar notes, $1 million notes. I mean, it was trillion. I think they might have had $1 trillion note, maybe.
Hey, Aaron?
Yep.
Can you speak to the point that the Germans created the government? The government helped create that. Absolutely. Because they wanted to devaluate the mark, so they didn't, to devalue the amount that they owed the Allies.
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. I mean, there was, let's be honest, there was an extremely punitive response after World War I to the Germans. You could absolutely understand it at a military level, but at a social economic level, we also just weren't as developed in our understanding too. I mean, remember, this is, people like John Maynard Keynes were, on the true bleeding edge of understanding, let's call it pre-behavioral economics, let's call it, modern macroeconomics. So, we were figuring out that, well, maybe it's not a great idea to nuke a society for a long time after you defeat them in war. I mean, that's sort of obvious now, but I just, people really wanted to punish Germany and Germans for World War One, for what it did to, tens of millions of people. And so obviously the Germans responded with the few tools they had in their toolbox, which was they could control the
May I
issue. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something there because foreign exchange is actually my thing.
Right.
After the First World War, they really tried to put everything back the way it was before the First World War, and that is the fatal mistake. I get the impression that it was in other areas as well, not just foreign exchange.
That's a great point.
But they additionally put on those reparations.
Mm-hmm.
And in our modern understanding of foreign exchange, if it's pegged like that, and you can't move it because it's on the gold standard, you will get inflation. And the person who actually put it down was Gustav Schlesman, who was the Treasury Secretary in Germany and then later briefly the Chancellor. And he managed to tame it by indirectly linking it to the equity markets.
Yeah. He basically securitized it, is what he did. It was actually genius. I mean,
when is this happening? What are the dates?
I think this 24. Isn't this 24? Something like that.
I can't remember. We could.
We Google
Schlesman.
Yeah, I think it's 24 or 25. I mean, yeah. So that's a fantastic point, which is, and I know we got onto this cycle here, but I think it does matter because it sets this.
Aaron, I hate to stop you. Can you let people through waiting room? I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. All right. Sorry for you waiting. Hopefully, Rachel, you didn't wait too long.
Sorry.
Sir.
One more thing. How do you devalue 100 million in gold being owed after the Versailles Agreement by Germans? That I don't understand.
Yeah. So you actually I forgot. Who was that just spoke? Is that
well, James.
James.
Oh, James. Yeah. Sorry. I mean, Jay's had a fantastic point here, which is, and it's one of the reasons, the end of Bretton Woods and the modern sort of creation of the financial system. I'm a little bit of a financial nerd too, so maybe we'll create something weird on that one day. But when you link to gold and there was, a finite amount of it, or at least the perception of a finite amount of it, I mean, you really anchor, which was the whole premise for, a large amount of history, let's put it that way, because people didn't want inflation. But if you also have these, let's call them external punitive financial relationships, right? That are there. You're sort of in this negative feedback loop, right? It's continuous, right? You can't get enough gold to generate enough hard currency to pay enough debt. You obviously can't generate enough economic output domestically because you have so much inflation, because the only way to have people from literally starving to death is to generate, let's call it artificial currency, basically allow their M2, the money supply, to explode. And so it was just this vicious feedback loop. And that's why when Germany sort of fixed it, and it was really, I would say, a massive Band-Aid is what it was. I mean, I don't think they quote unquote fixed it because they still had those debts, but they were able to sort of triage and, stop the main arteries from.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Well, just real quick, and I'll let you go, Paul. But Germany was not on the gold standard. They'd gone off it just prior to the First World War, as all the countries did. And then they went back to it in 1924. So the period of hyperinflation in the currency was when they didn't have to tie it to their gold reserves. They could just print paper unlimitedly, which is what they did.
Well, yeah, what they did is Schlesman introduced the Rentenmark, a new currency, based on and he took his cues as to how it should be locked and valued by the equities market, as I said. And he didn't quite get the permission of everybody else to do this. He just did it. But he did get the buy-in of Aristide Briand, who was the French equivalent for his job. And they actually also talked about having a common market. So as for people who are in foreign exchange, like we always think of Schlesman as being a very, very advanced thinker. And in taming that hyperinflation, and that we use it still to try and well, not we. I'm just a humble trader, but the people who use it as central banks, and they use the same theories in effect today.
Didn't the Nazis kill him because he was too successful?
No, he died, I think, on his porch by a heart attack, I thought. But I may be wrong on that, but he's very well celebrated. And it's a pity, like so many things, that he did not survive. That.
So
Paul had a question before.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yep.
Paul.
Thanks. And if I can't see you guys with your hands, then please just jump in, whoever you are. Thanks, Paul.
Paul? Okay, just continue.
He might be watching the game.
There is a game on?
Yes,
By the way, I wanted to make an appropriate joke. I mean, that guy's heart deflated. I'm sorry.
There you go. Exactly. Dun. So one of the things I wanted to show is that there was all these plans, right? All these, most of them introduced by senators or secretary of treasurers type, the usual people who introduce these sort of large strategic plans in American and sort of modern world history. And the reason it's important is that, I believe one of the reasons it's important is that it starts to govern the guardrails, right? It starts to press in the guardrails, and it's all of this isolationism and these, basically you could say legal heuristics that sort of, funnel almost all of our behavior in the 1930s. So there was a Young Plan in 1930, which at that point, and it's all relative, Germany owed 26 billion, 350 million, which was going to be paid over 58 and a half years, right? At a certain point, that just became insane, right? It was just, it was going to become so socially onerous. And so
well, the point, it's John here, the point of the Young Plan, I thought it lowered the payments, but it stretched.
Yeah, no, it stretched it out, but remember, part of this was we wanted to get paid back, right? We did not have the modern banking system, right? We didn't have all the tools that you define it, right? The Federal Reserve was really just not even 20 years old at that point, and it was a shell too, right? It was not what you'd call the modern central bank. And you didn't have really any banking regulatory structure. All that was created, in the early early mid 1930s under FDR. And so one of the big risks was we were not going to get paid back, which was a very big risk actually. So our goal was to sort of stretch this out in a way that we could get paid back. A very interesting point that a lot of people don't know is even after the war, the Germans paid all this off. Actually, it's pretty interesting. It's just a total sidebar there. But anyways, and then there was the Locarno Pact.
Question before you go past that slide.
Sure.
A question on the previous slide.
Yep.
Whose image is that?
Oh, I know you always ask about the images. I'll
somebody's propaganda.
Yeah.
At that time. So who's
no? This was
that?
German propaganda that basically said. Now, obviously, it's German, but I don't know which.
Right. So so those they have that socialist.
Exactly.
Mural type.
It was. It had this idea that basically for the next 3 generations, you're going to have to slave away to pay off.
It was a major campaign issue for Hitler. This 1930 was the big breakthrough year.
Yep, exactly.
And it could be Nazi, the image. So
I'll look that up.
That's it. And right.
Yeah, I'll look that up.
I've seen it a lot, actually.
I just looked it up. What did you say?
And Aaron, I just wanted to make a distinction. In terms of being paid back, there were kind of 2 dimensions of that regarding the reparations.
Yep.
I mean, France was the one that was really down, really on to that. We want to be paid back and we don't care what happens. Now, in terms of us, we wanted to be paid back, but in a different way. We had lent by floating big bonds. These are the big, typical big houses, Goldman Sachs, et cetera. This is a whole new area of international finance.
That's right.
We had
Rothschilds, exactly.
We had bought a bunch of German bonds and thereby given them money, which was to be used to pay France for the reparations. So there was like a two-headed, two-vise thing going on there.
Yep. No, that's a fantastic point also, is that, so in the same way that we're always far more loosely coupled is the way I like to look at it in our political economic system, France was not like that, right? So you had a far more, let's call it national structure when it came to its financial system, its government, its industries. And so we, in essence, acted as sort of, it's a great point you make, really kind of the security, like the securitization market, our government acted as that. So then our merchant banks could participate in it. But it did create a lot of risk because you had, and I don't want to get in the weeds here, but you had term structure. I mean, you had a ton of risk, right? By modern terms, like, no one would, these were the credit default swaps of that era, right? I mean,
and they didn't want war. I mean, those financial
Absolutely.
interests, as opposed to maybe commercial sector interests.
That's right.
They wanted those bonds repaid, and war could lead to suspension of payment of bonds. Right. But France, of course, had also suffered so much more, the British as well, but since it was a lot on French soil from World War I, that they were always fighting. They wanted that punitive reparations, and it was meant to be punitive on Germany, and it was always a tooth and nail battle to get them to, for example, in the plan you just described, get them to, loosen things up a little over time.
That's right. This is one that's really fascinating to read about, the Clark memorandum. Now, one thing, one of the reasons I really dove into this is the more I read about Japanese strategists, and it's like this, I think, today. People from, not people like everyday people in general, but people who are strategic in responsibility in other nations, pay enormous and sometimes maybe too much attention to the goings on in our political system, and obviously then kind of try to read tea leaves, and then obviously take their biases and pitch their strategies to within their government. And what really not just surprised me, because it wasn't surprising, but just the degree was more surprising. What really was very interesting is the amount of Japanese strategic and important thinkers that had huge influence that really knew what was going on. I mean, easily as much as bureau heads of newspapers did in the United States. I mean, they were on top of it. A lot of it had to do with the exchange, right? There was a lot of Japanese intellectuals and, let's say, elites that either furthered their education here or had their base education in some cases. Like they wound up basically getting dual degrees, one here and one in Japan over on a particular, whether engineering or, like a famous case is Admiral Yamamoto, who went to Harvard. And it wasn't like he went to Harvard for like, a couple of weeks to attend a seminar. I mean, like he lived in Cambridge. Like there's actually, if you go to Cambridge, there's an actual, like still the old brownstone that he actually rented a little room in for, the period he was there, which is really weird actually, so you had this incredible analysis. And so the Clark memorandum, which literally was irrelevant in the United States, which is really fascinating. So this was a complete rebuke of the Monroe Doctrine and the extension to the Monroe Doctrine, which was basically Teddy Roosevelt created the Monroe Doctrine 2.0, and Secretary of State Reuben Clark, who was Hoover's Secretary of State, or became Hoover's Secretary of State also, he basically continued. He was he was the author of this, and understand this wasn't him on the cutting edge, right? This was very well supported, and realize what this means.
Directed against. I mean, who were the potential people who would be intervening in Latin America?
Well, no, so understand the history of the Monroe Doctrine, which was basically our version, a lot less worse, but sometimes bad, like bad, of what Japan was constructing as a co-prosperity sort of sphere of influence. This was our version of that, going back, about 100 years, which basically stated we did not want a great power in the Americas, except for ourselves.
What I mean is, specifically, is there? What's the intent of that?
This means, I mean, at a simple
vision, the adversary would be.
Well, no. So before we get to that, number one, this basically signals we aren't sending your sons, not just to Europe. We're not sending your sons to Latin America to fight for things either.
So it's to a domestic audience.
Absolutely. And I mean, that was the heart and soul of it, is that we are not, but recognize like how significant that is, right? It's one thing to say you're not going to go send, doughboys to fight the crazy European world where they just love fighting each other for 5,000 years, right? You could sort of buy that one, right? That one is probably not that irrational actually at that point in time in history. But when you are in essence, in some ways, not fully, but I'd say in a decent amount, advocating your regional sphere of influence, that sent a huge signal, and especially to the Japanese. And of course, just like today, we'll do one thing and then change it a year later. But if you're from another, especially a much more closed, much more, let's say, integrated strategic culture like Japan was, even though they had all their chaos and their politics, the people who thought they were right and they were militarist and they had this sort of linear view of the world, they would just push aside any other data, like most people like that, that sort of conflicted with what they believed was the new course of action. So they viewed, America is not going to defend its existing holdings and rights, and then that became a lot of the basis. I mean, there were references up until the planning of Pearl Harbor that basically said, it's one of the reasons that if you basically punch the Americans hard enough in the face and knock out a battleship, they'll cry about losing pride, and they're not going to want to get headfirst into a war like this. It was this complete misreading of a period of time that made sense in 1928 to do this, but 10, 15 years later, obviously didn't. So this one was actually pretty big. And then there was so there's a whole bunch of these. I don't necessarily, at some point, if you guys want me to go, there's a ton of these. It's really amazing when you dig in. There's really dozens of pacts, of laws, of sort of, non-aggression, non-intervention treaties that the United States was really either looking to lead or was party to, and so this one, of course, the fact that you outlaw aggression and war, that's great, but it's like, telling a 6-year-old that, you have to sit in the chair for 2 hours and you can't move, right? At a certain point, I think there's an irrationality to believe that was something that was actually doable, whether then or now, but especially then. And of course, it fed this whole feedback loop in the United States, which basically said, yep, see, we're not going to have to do this stuff anymore. We're not going to have to invest in this. We don't have that risk anymore. Right. And then,
could you remind me, sorry, if I may,
please.
Who was Kellogg?
Oh, so Kellogg was, let me make sure if he's a senator, or let me get this right here.
I was an American. Yeah.
Yeah.
Something.
So let me.
I know Briand was the finance minister in France.
Yes, exactly. And let me a second here. So yes, he was a senator, but he was Secretary of State at that point, Frank Kellogg. So, and that PAC helped him get a Nobel Prize, because, it sort of sounds like there will be no alien invasions, right? You'd probably give a Nobel Prize for someone that got everyone to agree that if aliens invade, we'll stop them, right? It sounds so sort of absurd, but recognize that you had this continuity between Clark and Kellogg. They were friends. They vacationed together. So there was just this alignment in thinking that says, basically, the United States is going to be this new, more almost advanced unaggression state, and that's of course what our culture wanted, right? There was very few people. There was obviously intellectuals, and there were some brilliant people who were writers and who were in the news industry and so on, in media of that era, who saw sort of the unraveling of the world that was going on in the East and in Europe, and in the Soviet Union, whatever. But they really were writing to each other, right? It's almost like people to this day, if you look at all the few Russian studies programs. So the very famous guy, Stephen Cohen, passed away a week ago. No blip at all. Not that I agreed with everything he wrote, but point is that he was a big scholar for decades, and in the United States, and many other places in the world, just nobody cares, right? It's just, no one wants to say, "Ooh, I'm going to go read Russian studies," right? It's you can't even finance graduate and dissertation programs. So anyways, we talked about Japanese attack of Manchuria, which is sort of this, China invasion 1.0 that started in 1931. They installed their own puppet, sort of dictatorship. Now the Japan leaves the League of Nations. So the League of Nations said, you shouldn't do this, stop it now. And, Japan basically said, all right, well, you call the police and figure it out. And of course that didn't exist. Now, Hoover wanted nothing to do with this. Now, recognize when this was happening, right? This was, 18 months after the crash, and we were, the world was falling apart in terms of a depression. And especially the United States, we had, the first 18 months of the depression in the United States was, it was more, it was really closer to medieval type of a depression, where you literally leveled, social orders, cities, cultures. It was everywhere, right? And so there was not going to be an army that was going to raise the United States to go to Manchuria and fight the Japanese. That was not going to happen. So the Hoover Stimson doctrine, this was important too, because what this boiled down to is the United States, in a weird way, sort of said, the way, if you look at how the Nordic countries today use soft power, not to say they don't participate in NATO and in UN missions and so on, they obviously do, but they really position themselves to be these sort of soft power, micro superpowers, right? They have these intricate models of how to, or at least try to leverage these institutions or to leverage their foreign policy. And obviously it's different today than it was, 80, 90 years ago, but what Hoover and Senator Simpson wanted to do is basically say, all right, great. If you're going to go do these things that aren't, that are not legal, we will not recognize any of the acquisitions that are achieved by force. So it was a very modern, cutting edge approach. And it was a doctrine too. It wasn't just like a single act of sanctions like you have against Russia for their invasion of Crimea. But this became really, in some ways, sort of a replacement of the doctrinal view that the United States had, which was to either be interventionist or be isolationist. It sort of sat in the new middle ground. And of course, Japan saw any slight, even some of it was valid, because they viewed obviously our actions in the Philippines and other places as really their version of the extension, right? They viewed, in sort of their strange logic, the acquisition of Manchuria and China as sort of our version of fusing the Monroe Doctrine together in our taking over of colonial possessions for our Navy, basically, and forward operating bases. And then so FDR had the good neighbor policy. So what this was sort of interesting. So FDR recognized that the Clark doctrine was probably not a great idea, and Stimson helped him recognize that, which was, look, you cannot, in the world we're clearly in now, this was, by 33, going to 34, it's obvious that the goals, at this point, 15 years earlier, right? So it's not just a few years, were not getting attained. So we needed to have a new policy. And what this was, you'd almost argue was more modern. It was almost like a micro NATO, really, that the U.S. is in essence going to respect our own rights and the rights of these other countries in the Western Hemisphere. It was definitely targeted at Mexico and large South American powers at that point that were either newly independent or started to have early intervention, almost proxy-like from global powers. So it was a signal, like the Clark was a signal. This was a signal too that said, all right, the U.S., we're not going to butt in, but if those nations want our support, we'll provide that support. which I think this made a lot of sense. And this was also FDR sort of moving the goalpost, and that's the key about FDR. I mean, FDR is arguably one of the, he probably is the greatest domestic sort of political, sort of Jedi in history, right? I mean, his ability to sort of read our politics and not just sort of read them at a macro level, but really at a micro level, like not to box in a senator. It didn't matter if it was from his party or not, in a place in his state by doing something, because that could give him a mark, right? That can give him a chip in the game. And he used language, right? I mean, he played cards, right? He played cards with most of these people. So he had that sort of, I don't want to say hustler, that's the wrong way to look at it, but this very, almost like world-class card playing view of, if I don't need to bury somebody that isn't an ally, I'm not going to do that politically. And so what he started doing is he implemented these policies. Some of them weren't acts, right? So it was almost the equivalent of executive orders, some of it which then could be converted into an act, right? So he really massaged. You could argue he's absolutely the first modern leader in the United States, and arguably one of the first modern leaders in the whole world, because he really, he took his administrative power and his sort of political massaging power together, and he sort of integrated them, right? And he did this for, better part of a decade, which, is incredible when you think about, this whole idea of when a leader comes in, they have 90 days, they have 60 days. He had one of those too, but he just kept, and some people would say to him, Mr. President, your 90 days are up. And he says, no, that was the last 90 days. I got another 90 days, right? He just had this view of he's going to win every set of 90 days, which I don't know how many leaders have been really like that in all of modern history. But so he also recognized the Soviet Union at the end of 1933.
Aaron, can I ask you a quick question? And this is probably a question for everybody. Would we have chosen FDR having social network at the 1930s, for example, for argument's sake? I mean, knowing what we know, so would we have chosen FDR in that case? I mean, we knew that he couldn't walk and all that stuff. So would we have made that choice?
That's a fantastic question. I believe we would have, and that's my bias. And it's not because, I have a man crush on him, but I look at it as, I just think he was such a sophisticated political actor. He would have found a way to make that work for him, right? It's almost like people with him always wanted to believe, oh, well, if people find out about this, well, it's like, yeah, but the guy had a vote too, right? I mean, he could adjust. So anyways, that's my bias on this, but I'll let everybody else go on that.
Yeah, I think we had, it was a different public then with regard to viewing the presidency. And we'd already tolerated at that point, Wilson had a major stroke, and his wife basically ran the White House for almost a year.
That's right.
So I agree with Aaron. I don't think had that been revealed, as long as he was still competent intellectually, which he obviously was, then I don't think that would have made a difference. They might almost have been more afraid of his international image.
Yeah.
People like Stalin might have taken that, although those people all knew. They knew from their diplomatic intelligence.
What was really different about FDR was that he dealt as an ally with the American labor movement, which at that point was just emerging and really transforming the world. That's the era of the general strikes, the formation of the UAW, and they were a tremendously solid bloc. And being working class in those days meant being on the left, something entirely different than it means today.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. But the thing he also did, and when you look at the results in 28, and I mean in the 32, I should say, in 32 election, I mean, and a lot of people don't do this, but if you look at the districts he won, I mean, he won. He had a landslide across Republican district. What were, remember, not 2020 Republican districts, but we're talking, 1928. 1932, which is almost the old version of being liberal, right? Not in terms of being on the left, but in terms of liberalism. He won a landslide in almost 80% of those districts. So I just think people recognized him as an astute political leader who just had a plan and had sort of a pretty salient rock star team, and then and let's not underestimate his oratory, skills were just absolutely incredible. I mean, it's just his ability to leverage radio, not that others hadn't used radio, but just his ability to sort of communicate very effectively, right? I mean, he wouldn't have these 2-hour speeches just going on and on and on and on, right? These were very short, always crisp, always 1, maximum 2 points, and he used to do this really wild thing. I've read a couple biographies. So whenever he was going to do a speech, or not whenever, but sometimes when you do a speech, and speech writers and his big political allies would get there and they would kind of argue about things, he would ask a lot of them to bring family members. And they thought, FDR was a genius in manipulating people, right? So everyone thought, oh, wow, going to the White House, you're bringing wives and husbands and this and that. And then the first thing he would do, he'd leave all those experts in another room. He'd go to the other room and he'd give kind of a pre-speech, and he'd always tell them, don't talk about this with anyone, including who you're with. And then he would really tell them, you can blast me, tell me what makes sense and doesn't make sense. And that's remarkable. I mean, that tells you someone who's using this really in a modern way that very few people do. I mean, because you're not just getting what your experts think is going to work, but you're getting, let's say maybe not purely common people, but definitely non-expert views from people's families. And he just had this ability to sort of be very dynamic. I mean, today in the business world, we just call this being agile, right? Everyone wants to be agile in everything, in government, business, and tech and everything, school, education, whatever. But I would say he was an agile leader that way. So
may I ask, though, that if on the question of in today's environment, would he have succeeded to been elected even? One does wonder, because he had such a compliant press, which is not the case now. My understanding, it may be just something from a film I saw, but the press would not photograph him in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
And that's definitely not the case now. And people seem to make up their minds on matters in a study of about 5 minutes or maximum. And they have too many. It depends on what his pre-existing image was.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I mean, the one thing I would say is I remember reading about one of his, let's say more, what were called the brain trust. So that's what they called them. I mean, literally they called them the brain trust, which was part of his, his team of rock stars that, almost every leader in the modern world everywhere has tried to replicate, and generally not very successfully. But he had one person named Lewis Howell, who was this sort of reporter, but he was really a political advisor. I mean, he was a classic insider that, would have, by today's standards, been not allowed to still be a reporter, right? He was a hack for FDR, obviously. But
may I ask one other thing on that?
Yep.
When were women allowed to vote and other And
yeah, in 1919, 1920, it started. Now, obviously, it started with, well, it wasn't just as simple as white and black. It started with, let's just say, more northern progressive states. Remember how, I mean, we're republic and we have federalism here, right? So when you get an act, when you pass a amendment, you then have to, you know, obviously write your own state regulatory structure, right? And then that's a way to sort of slow roll it, right? So you had a slow rolling of that in the 20s, but outside of the certain states that still had oppressive voting restrictions in the South, basically FDR's election, by FDR's election, really by Hoover's election 28, a very large percentage of women in the United States, you know, actually could participate and participated. By FDR's election, it was, you know, it wasn't exactly parity with men, but I mean, I think it was about 70%. It was pretty high. And you know, and then obviously by the 40s, it got, you know, it's really kind of been about, well, it was about the same all the way till, I think it was in the late 70s, early 80s that, you know, we've gotten to sort of pure parity.
It's funny. It's taken Saudis 100 years to recognize women to vote.
Yeah, no, it's true.
From us.
No,
just a comment on women's voting. That's something I've studied a fair bit.
Right.
Actually, there were 15 states that allowed women to vote
True.
by state constitutional amendments before the federal amendment in 1920.
Yep.
So 1920 really allowed women to vote. However, it didn't really have any effect on the outcomes. It wasn't until 1980, until Reagan, that
Right.
the gender gap appeared.
That's
Since
right.
now, of course, there's a very strong gender gap. Women and men vote fairly differently, but that wasn't throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s,
Yep.
50s, 60s, 70s.
You're absolutely
That wasn't
right.
true. It wasn't until
And you know what's fascinating, Ralph? It's a great point you bring up, is that wasn't even a white-black thing either, right? So you wouldn't have a gender gap, really, period, right? You had people who just had a political, I mean, this gets back to this sort of provincialism we had, right? We were very provincial. So you had people in a provincial sense voting on a regular basis. FDR was one of those sort of, you know, super politicians that sort of truly nationalized his brand. So I think that was different for him, obviously. But you really didn't have a lot of, let's say, super brand politicians back then. And things were just not nationalized, obviously, like they are. Everything's nationalized. I mean, I've always participated in local, sort of like really like local politics, because I just like it. It's sort of in the weeds. And I'm telling you, you could ask 9 out of 10, not forget 9 out of 10, you know, 29 out of 30 people to name who their town mayor is, or who their who's on their city council or whatever. And just most people don't know and don't care. That was really, in some ways, the opposite back then. People really knew who was in their local politics. And there was national politics that felt so distant, right? It's back to that sort of isolation. And a lot of this has to do with transportation, right? I mean, this was the first era of people even having cars, you know, and not, this wasn't everyone having a car either, but let's say maybe the top half, you know, maybe was able to get their first car, you know, something like that with radios too, right? I mean, so people really didn't engage in the outside world, outside of your sort of provincial definition of where you lived and maybe where you worked, and that was it. And, you know, where you went to church or temple or, you know, whatever. And that was your world, right? Most people weren't sitting there saying, oh, wow, California's water policy is changing, right? Like that, just the people didn't do that. I mean, I'm not saying there weren't a few nerds, there always are in history, but on average, people didn't do that. So one quick point so this guy, Lewis Howe, is a fantastic person to read about, because he's really one of these classic fixers, right? Old, like historical fixers. He always had ready this sort of, you know, he kind of called it Plan plan. Everyone called everything Plan X-ray back then. I don't know. I think this had to do with Flash Gordon and all those books and things like that. But he called it Plan X-ray. That if anyone ever really attacked FDR, being, in a wheelchair or any kind of disability, he would bring, it would be like a week-long event of World War I disabled vets in the White House, just pummeling it on media for like 24 hours a day, round the clock, pictures, so he was going to anesthetize it, right, by linking it to, basically the superheroes of World War I, which was a brilliant strategy, which I'm convinced he would have done. I mean, why wouldn't he have done that, right? And so I just think he had people around him that were, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but that were so politically intelligent and craven, they were going to do whatever it took to make sure FDR succeeded. And I just think that's unique about him in that period of history. So the recognition of the Soviet Union was a big deal to Japan, like everything, right? Basically, every time we woke up, it was a big deal to Japan. This is this sort of collision I keep sort of talking about that we were sort of, maybe we were kind of ignorantly stumbling into, but the Japanese weren't. They felt, that this was us ganging up with the Soviets on Japan, right? They viewed everything from their perspective. We viewed it, to be blunt, just as an opportunity for trade. I mean, there were it was a tiny number of advisors that clearly had a, let's say, definitely more pro-Soviet and, even, let's say, early proto-socialist, pro-Marxist almost view, but it was a tiny number. The majority of people just looked at it as like, we can just sell them things, right? And we could convert it to we could build our way out of this depression. Now that was his driver behind it, which, by the way, almost no one cared. So this literally didn't get any airtime. It's funny. I had to go looking, and I'm sure Mikhail can tell us what this says if he wants to. But I tried.
It's in Ukrainian. It's not in Russian.
Oh wow!
I can understand one word.
It's in Ukrainian, but I think it was issued here in the United States.
Yeah, it says right there, Michigan Street,
right.
Hamtramck, Michigan.
Yeah, that's Chicago. Yeah, that's in Chicago. So,
yeah.
This got no. I mean, like, this literally had no record. I think the Times had 3 articles on it, right? The Times back then would write, books on just irrelevance. I mean, just, it's funny. You read the Times today when they can be a little long, but you go back and try to read stuff from the 30s. It's like, God, just finish this article. They definitely were paying by the word back then. And as the old saying goes, but so this was another big slight. The Nye committee hearing. So Senator Nye from North Dakota, this thing landed like a bombshell back then. So this was, so Senator Nye and Senator Truman, there was a whole bunch of bipartisan politicians in America that basically looked at American business interests as not being aligned with quote unquote America's interest, meaning they were war profiteering, they were just doing, they were supplying munitions to the enemy, and so this sort of kept feeding this isolationism. So this was another, and ultimately it turned into, this whole concept, which some of you might have, this was sort of a popular term. There's a few books, I think a bad Nicolas Cage movie even, on which, there's enough of those. That's my Nicolas Cage joke for the day. The merchants of death, that was a term. And that, basically, the whole theory was they were using American policy and Americans as a tool to make money on the First World War. And obviously, and one of the big claims, which wasn't true, was that it provoked the Germans. When the Germans sunk, I think the Germans were going to sink an American ship. They were going to, if they had to come to Port of Newark, they were going to do it. But anyways, that, it had huge support. It was bipartisan. And this resulted in what's called the Neutrality Acts, which is kind of everything I've been leading up to. And this is the I Hate War speech, the Ludlow Amendment, which is a proposed amendment to the Constitution that called for a national referendum on a declaration of war by Congress. I mean, can you imagine? Like, it's just the aliens would land and you wouldn't declare war, right? Because there'd be some people saying, well, let's wait and see what their technology is, right? I mean, it was just, this never passed, but it still got a lot of votes. It just told you how wired into that point of view we had, so he was a Democrat from Indiana. So, it was really nothing to do with political party at this point. And the Neutrality Acts, which of course the Japanese saw all of this as, the United States is giving us free reign and they're not going to respond, right? That's how this was completely read. So what the Neutrality Acts basically said is that, we couldn't sell anything to belligerent nations. We couldn't lend anything. We couldn't travel on vessels of nations at war. Non-military goods must be purchased on a cash and carry basis, basically, COD, right? Remember that if you were a kid here back in the day in the 70s or 80s, the door opens and you have to have the money for the post office person. Which of course this was about constraining all the power that the president could have. And of course, obviously the US basically declined to build up its forces. And we talked a little bit about the Panay incident, which was in December 12th, 1937. This was the, I don't know what there's a cool French phrase for this, like this was the finished moment or whatever. I don't know what that's.
Fait accompli.
Thank you. The fait accompli, yes.
I was going to say coup de grâce.
Yes, that too. Yes, all of them. French have great terms for this, which basically the Japanese sunk this was not a modern gunboat. This was like World War I, barely World War I gunboat. It was pretty much junk. But they also sunk 3 Standard Oil tankers on the Yangtze River. And the river was international waterway. And Japan was, obviously testing our resolve. They apologized, which they mocked that, right? They felt that was absurd, right? And then they had to pay some money, which basically from a face perspective, they viewed that as the ultimate insult, right? That to your people, to your culture, to your nation, to your God, to that whole integrated view the Japanese had. And of course most Americans were like, that's great. It sucks for the people that were there, but once again, we don't have to go to war, which was a big deal.
And Aaron, I
Yep.
would just mention that when as your slide very aptly put out, it was like no aid to belligerent nations.
That's
and I
right.
think a lot of the public at the time interpreted that to mean any nation that was an aggressor. But in point of fact, the way the act was enacted was that it would be either side. And that's what precluded us, I'm sure you're going into, from being able to lend assistance to Britain initially.
Exactly.
Because they were under the definition a belligerent nation. They weren't the aggressor nation, but they were in a war stance vis-a-vis Germany. So it was a very badly drafted act that most people didn't really understand the full implications till it hit them in the face.
Well, I assume the motive was, I forget the number of Americans who died in the Lusitania sinking in World War I. I mean, that I can see where the drafters would have not wanted Americans to be sailing on any a ship belonging to any country engaged in warfare. I mean, that the isolationists would have, recalled the Lusitania incident.
No, absolutely. And remember, we talked about the Rye laws, right? Or the Rye Committee, right? It was, it was, why are we in their backyard stirring stuff up?
But again, as I said, as you're going into, it meant FDR had to get kind of inventive when he wanted to assist Britain as they were being bombed by Germany with the Lend-Lease arrangement.
Oh, absolutely.
Which was a way around the restrictions of the Neutrality Act.
Nope, absolutely. Just
Well,
let me. Yep, go ahead.
Just sorry. Just recently I was reading about it. Stalin was so pissed with opening a second front. I don't know, maybe this is related or not. So, basically, the British president or prime minister was totally thinking of Stalin as an idiot, basically, and was trying to BS him, saying, we're opening a second front in Africa. And the next meeting they met, Stalin was completely outplaying the British president, saying, listen, I know you're BSing me. I don't care about Africa. I need you to open a second front in Europe. And he was completely mesmerized. And I mean, they were calling him Uncle Joseph, Stalin president. So to me, the collaboration with America, it's almost it didn't even need to happen because they were attacking in all the wrong places. While Russia was waiting for the help is a second front in Europe to rain down and help them with fighting with Hitler, because they were fighting at the time in Stalingrad. Just as a side note, I don't know if this is relative or not, but I'm just saying even that Lend-Lease fact with UK is like America was like, I'm fully contributing right now on the Far East, and I'm not thinking about Europe, and that second front was complete sham. At that time.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, there was this, and look, at a fundamental level, and that's, we can talk about that at a different time, but basically, the U.S. High Command, which was fighting a truly global two-front war, recognized that if it was going to have a sustainable, not just beachhead, but invasion of France, it was going to have a logistics train, as it's called, or that is gargantuan, right? That if we're going to put 1 million or more fighting men into France, we're going to have, it's not something you're going to flip a switch and get there. And I do think, if I'm going to be objective about it, Stalin had a point but at the same time, he also, I think, didn't recognize how substantially different, invading France from the UK was. It's like, the Germans knew we were coming. They didn't know where exactly, but they sort of knew in proximity terms. And you were going to have a massive beachhead and hold the beachhead and expand it. And I think, in some ways Stalin, and it's not just him, but I think maybe nobody could explain why that was so different. I mean, look, at the end of the day, topography matters. when you fight, right? And obviously the Soviets knew this because of their 1-1-1 record against the Finns. You know, and the Finns were, whatever, 10 to 100 times smaller. But that doesn't matter if you got to go across, tens of thousands of square miles of snow. You know what I mean? So I think there was a dimension there that he couldn't quite sort of grasp. But anyway, so let me get back to you guys. Let me see here. All right, sorry about that. Oh wait, I think I got to the wrong slide here. All right. Neutrality. Yes, here we go. So ultimately, this meant that our isolationism was was amplified by the Great Depression. Don't forget you had that open door China model that was this sort of approach after World War I that everybody had, which was basically treating China as this platform to extract as a nation state or as a people. And but it didn't matter because the United States really looked at that even as a commitment it didn't want to have. And obviously we were not investing in a that was going to project power.
Evan, sorry, who is this in the car with Roosevelt?
Oh, that's Hoover.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that's funny that you say that because he literally is not well. I mean, there's like one sort of, I'd call it the junior high picture of Hoover most people have where he has glasses on or that like reading old world, like reading glass. And he's sitting down. That's kind of like one of the few pictures that most people even have of him. Yeah, he was sort of put in the dustbin of history, and some of it had to boil down to,
Is it during the inauguration or power transfer?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This was during the inauguration.
When they ride from the White House to the Capitol.
Exactly.
And the new president, at this point, Hoover is still the president.
Yeah, technically, yeah, you're right.
Exactly. But I wanted to echo or ditto what you said about Hoover, Aaron, earlier. He was really a brilliant guy, but he was an engineer.
Yep.
He was sort of a Carter type,
Yeah, no, that's a great analogy.
He was a micromanager. The Depression kind of caught him off guard because he left that to the financial guys. He wasn't a financial guy.
I mean, it's a weird way that you put that, which is great, which is, weird. If anyone here that's old enough, and I remember that as a kid watching, I grew up on the West Coast. So Ted Koppel would come on at 8:30 at night, which was 11:30 here. And that's kind of how Ted Koppel became famous, I think, was a hostage crisis with Iran. In a strange way, the hostage crisis sort of mirrors what the Great Depression was for Hoover. It was just sort of like he wasn't equipped for that. And all of his sort of toolbox of micromanagement, which Hoover had exactly the same way, his staff, he drove his staff nuts. He was always asking for these ridiculous details that are just irrelevant that people people mid-level, junior mid-level people do it, for a living, and he always had this view that, and Hoover was always doing this. He was walking around the White House fixing things, right? He was arguing with plumbers. I mean, it was absurd, right? But that was his makeup as a person.
I think he had also played a major role in the reconstruction of Europe, the American reconstruction efforts after World War I.
Definitely.
He managed famine relief in the Soviet Union.
Yes, he did. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
I just want to say in defense of Hoover is that he didn't do so well in alleviating the Depression. His policies were wrong-headed, but Roosevelt really didn't do very well either. I mean,
look,
you look at the bottom line.
Yeah, no, if you look at the bottom line, it's a fair point, which is until we integrated sort of a macroeconomic approach as a response, to the Depression, right? Instead of sort of trying to play with individual dials, but integrate, basically we had a collapse of aggregate demand, right? We had to fill that and create financial stability by stabilizing the banking system until we sort of figured that one out. That's when I kind of look at FDR's Depression response as really kicking off and becoming successful. And that really wasn't until 35, 36, 37 that really, kind of kicks into gear. And for those first couple years, it was, but the difference was he was playing with dials. People wanted someone playing with dials. And it sounds funny because Hoover was someone who liked to play with dials, except that's where his sort of free market purism sort of kicked in. So in the one area was as someone who was good with playing with dials, or at least thought he was, that was an area he didn't want to intervene. And so I think that was sort of an advantage that FDR, and I think FDR gets just the benefit of it because he was trying. And I think at that point, we just wanted somebody trying. So I did this last time, a version of this, but basically this sort of feeds the whole US isolationism, right? So it wasn't just one thing, like it was one president or one senator or one sort of crude person in the media or one writer. I mean, this was a whole of society sort of, cultural approach to belief, which is the U.S. should become an isolationist, and even using the word power. There was a whole group of people, I forgot the name, I'll look it up, but who never even wanted us to use the word power, literally, because power, codified, strength and force and engagement. So this, it almost became, someone mentioned earlier, kind of like a proto-religious movement in a weird way. So one of the things that, and this is FDR sort of moving those goalposts, right, so as Japan obviously was starting to threaten our interest, we were not ready to sort of engage them in any way, right? We did not have a fleet that worked at that point to do that, and it was really in their backyard. So one of the things that he wanted to do is start with upgrading our existing fleet, because in the treaty, so the Treaty of Versailles didn't matter anymore, really, but in the United States it did, because it sort of created a heuristic, a rule of what you could and couldn't do. And of course, the isolationists would point to, you can't touch that capital ship because that's in a treaty we signed, even if nobody else is complying. So, in FDR's sort of genius, there was all these rules around how long ships could last and what the definition of capital was and so on. So he would go and trick and play these little games with upgrades and it was called Everyone Gets a Brother and a Sister. So there's a concept called building a sister ship, which is we're gonna try to upgrade this one, but if it doesn't work, the treaty says we can replace it. So what he would do is, don't try too hard, then obviously replace it with a new sister ship, and then quote unquote mothball the other one, but not scrap it, and then turn around at a certain point and upgrade it, right? I mean, so he definitely skirted the line. Let's just be very honest. I mean, basically he broke the law. Let's just be real about it. So what FDR would do every time there's an event, so this is where he was a genius also, was whenever there was something he knew he had to respond to, he would stake out this extreme isolation position publicly, and then he would do something else privately. And of course, everyone played this kabuki game, right? The Navy played this game, the people sort of in power played this. So, so when it was pretty clear we were going to have to rebuild the Navy, he timed that with his quarantine speech. And so, you know, so he just constantly sort of played this game, basically, of, you know, we're going to quarantine the Japanese and not buy things from them that are going to feed them, you know, building a navy or invading, whatever. That's going to prove we're isolationists. That proves we're not, you know, going to be going to war. I mean, he would walk this completely through. And then by 38, you know, Japan was clearly establishing this new order in East Asia, right? I mean, this was not, you know, no one was really debating that at this point, right? And he'd also sort of worn out. I mean, it's just because of how, you know, what a Jedi he was about this stuff. He sort of wore out all the isolationists, right? They would be in fits, right? He could play them. He could meet them and tell them one thing. He'd give a speech, which is different. And then there'd be an act passed, which was a third thing. And then he'd implement a fourth thing. And then behind the scenes, there'd be a fifth thing, right? And he did this with dozens, really, almost probably hundreds of different policies. And, you know, and so what's interesting is that strategic ambiguity, which is basically what it was, how much of that you could get away with today, really. I think that might be the bigger question, whether he could get elected or not. I think he would, but, or he'd stand a very strong chance of, and he'd probably keep running until he did. But if he could get away with the amount of ambiguity and sort of skirting, you know, I forgot what it's called. What's it called? Yeah, like the letter of the law, you know, like the intent of the law. So this was the status of sort of Japan, which we've gone over at this point before, going into the late 30s, and sort of, you know, their possessions and their sort of view of the world. And
Aaron, I wanted to ask you, how much U.S. public perception do you think was there at this period, early 1938, of the Japanese atrocities, war atrocities in, you know, Nanjing and Manchuria? Was that an element or no?
It was. I mean, there were these, you know, famous, amazing, just like there always are, kind of war reporters that for, you know, sophisticated people. So if you ask the right people in intellectual circles in New York and Boston and Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia and Chicago, whatever, you know, I'm sure they would be reasonably acquainted with it. But if you ask sort of the average person who, you know, would read an AP Newswire as part of their local paper, you know, there was a sense the Japanese weren't, you know, they were definitely not on the right side of things. They were doing bad things. There would be pictures occasionally, but it just didn't elevate to, I mean, it seemed in a strange way, and I sort of view it this way now. We in the modern world, because of technology and transportation, you know, we perceive, whether it's right or wrong, that we can get to some other part of the world within a period of time and do something, whatever that something is. Most of the time, probably not effective, but whatever, we perceive that. People just didn't perceive that then. I mean, there wasn't this sense that you could sail 100-ship navy somewhere and do something, right? It just did. It seemed like it was like in outer space. Right. It's almost like, you know, imagine somebody doing something on the moon. What would you do about it right now? Nothing. Right. You would just at a certain point not worry about it. It's just some other foreign place.
Or Mars. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm wondering, however, if at least among, you know, policymakers in DC, and as you said, as we call them, influence thought leaders in places like New York and Boston, that gave President Roosevelt a certain amount of leeway with his kind of tricks regarding the neutrality prohibition, because people realized, you know, Germany was bombing England and Japan was doing all these aggressive things in the Far East, and that this thing was something, but Congress didn't want to totally back down and repeal the Neutrality Act.
Exactly.
So everybody kind of turned away when they knew what the president, and didn't call the president out when he was doing these things.
No, that's a fair point. I mean, so what I would say is, and FDR had the brain trust, so they were genius manipulators. So they would bring in, very moral, religious people, whether they were part of a church or they were, they had influence. And then they would do these sort of other briefings on the side to sort of try to break up the isolationists. So that's a fair point you made, is that there was some, he was always nudging, right? He was always looking for weaknesses in some other counterparty that he had to deal with. And I'll tell you, this was, when I really dug into this is what made this really, I mean, I just think it's just absolute genius. So instead of fighting all these acts, what the brain trust finally said is, all right, fine, let's use them as almost like super soft power, right? Let's use the toolbox and now apply it to the Japanese by, going over literally a 2-year period, basically an embargo on planes and aviation parts. We suspended all credit to the Japanese, all our trade reciprocity. We obviously put our fuel and scrap metal embargo on.
Yeah, the oil embargo, I think that really, boy,
yeah,
that was the thing that made Japan hurt.
Yeah, no, it really did. And I have a sort of a slide on that. And then you could see this is, obviously, Japanese national supported political art, but this was a view. Nice tie, though, I would say. They kind of, but big hands, this sort of Frankenstein-like figure. And we don't have anybody here that speaks or writes in Japanese or kanji, but I'm sure that doesn't say he's a great guy. And so, there was a view of, him in Japan, somewhat in that view we've seen all through modern history, which is he's making us do this, right? It's not really us. He's the bad guy, and it's the Americans that are the bad guy in this case. So one thing to recognize is the Japanese dependence on not just American oil, but the contracts we had in New Guinea that I was telling you about, or what became, New Guinea, basically Dutch East Indies. And of course, the Japanese interpreted this as this is encirclement, and then the Japanese really didn't have a lot of options, because
Aaron, who was supporting the Japanese? Who was supplying the Japanese?
I mean, to be honest, almost nobody. They were taking it. I mean, that's what they were doing. These were natural resource expansions, basically. And when you kind of look at their imperialism, it's interesting because a lot of, in all of history, right, there's been forms of imperialism for all kinds of reasons. The Japanese one, had multiple sort of drivers or threads, but one of the biggest ones was really natural resources. It always was, because they just, Japan organically does not have very much natural resource intensity, especially when you compare to Southeast Asia, the Soviet Union, Russia, the United States, Canada, the 4, 5, 6 places in the world that have a ton of natural resources. Japan is definitely not on the top side of that list. So, we kind of looked at this earlier, but this is what's going on in terms of them going into, across China, into Indochina, which was French Indochina, which, obviously, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, eventually, so this big push, and then across other small non-US islands. So they were really attacking almost everything that was not a direct US possession. And we talked about this earlier, which I don't necessarily go over. There's one piece here I'd like to get into. By the way, how much time do we have left? Because I want to know, or how much time do you guys want to go? You want to keep going? Because this part's not too long, U.S. naval readiness, and then I have, which the next time we could go over the Japanese strategy and how they basically prepared and how in this whole process of the U.S. basically responding to them. And so do you guys want me to just go over this and then we can call it a day, or what do you want me to do?
I'd say keep going, but I have a question.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. That's good. Good. Okay. So,
Aaron, I just wanted to footnote too. Japan did still get American oil.
Yes.
Up to 1941, they got about, I think, about 2/3 or so of their oil from the U.S. It's just that we had severely reduced it. And that was affecting the Japanese public because, of course, what oil they did get, they were at that point redirecting to the military.
Exactly. Well, so I have a slide here, which I'll go into, which, go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I have a slide I can go into in a little while, which breaks down a lot of the resources. And so, one of the big ones is basically Japan needed 400 tons of oil an hour, and that's refined oil. So it's really 800 tons because back then it was sort of a 2-to-1 ratio because you don't have the same kind of refining technology, chemical technology. Sorry, my daughter's getting.
Hey, Aaron, regarding your previous slide on Japanese aggression, and you list Taiwan, Manchuria, and the one before.
This one or the one before this?
One before. Yeah. So.
No,
Taiwan,
further.
No, the one. Yeah, right there. Boom.
This one. Okay.
No, the one before.
Oh, okay.
the one that lists.
Oh,
there.
yes. Sorry. Yeah.
Taiwan, Korea, and Manchuria. If you ask anyone from Manchuria or China what they think of the Japanese occupation, there's a lot of hate there.
Yes.
If you ask any Koreans the same question, there's a lot of hate there. You ask people from Taiwan, they kind of like, not so bad.
Yeah, I mean that one's interesting. I have a lot of really, a couple of my best friends are actually from Taiwan. They've been here about 40 years. And there's an interesting dynamic there. I think a chunk of that has to do with post-World War II and sort of Chiang Kai-shek versus Mao and the Japanese being party to supporting the formation of Taiwan as a state, basically the Republic of China, versus like some type of nostalgia from the 1890s and early 1900s. I will say this though, as I met my friend Steve, a couple of his older relatives. They do look at what Formosa was and that region was as really medieval prior to the Japanese coming there. So there is some connection to modernization, which, even though the Japanese did clearly terrible things, there's still some sort of nostalgia there around that, which I that sort of makes sense. I'm not necessarily like, it's not my choice to agree with it or not, but it does make sense on that connection because they view that they were part of this old feudal medieval world and the Japanese sort of helped modernize them, bringing them into the modern world.
Aaron, just let me add a quote to this because I had a friend from there, and there was an indigenous population on Taiwan which did not like the Han. And when I asked him, well, weren't the Japanese terrible? His response was Han or Japanese. At least when the Japanese left, we had roads and bridges, which is exactly what you were implying.
Exactly. No, that's exactly what it is. And so it's this really, I remember sort of thinking about that and it's not my place to sort of judge someone who, had their whatever oral history from their grandparents of what it was before. But it sort of gave me this sense of like, okay, I could I can sort of see that. You know, it's almost like they recognize like we were going to get screwed over by somebody, you know, and like you said, at least we got something out of it. And then I would say they've been a pretty solid partner of modern Taiwan, you know, Republic of China in the last, you know, 60 years, 70 years. So, which I think that has a lot to do with it. And then obviously the PRC hasn't been. So, let's see, we talked about this. All right, so the Depression, you know, we always sort of forget, I mean, you know, anyone would rationally forget this, that obviously when you have a Depression, well, you're probably not doing much with your Navy. And a lot of people forget this about navies, right? And it sounds sort of, what do you call it, reductionist, but, you know, ships float and they float in the ocean, which is corrosive. And so you need to spend a lot of time, money, energy keeping your ships, you know, up to, you know, maintenance and seaworthiness. And of course, the Depression really impacted that. I mean, actually incredibly dramatically. And then we had huge budget cuts, which, you know, some of which were natural because you just were, you know, you just had less, you know, revenue coming in from tax receipts. But then some of it was around the neutrality and the isolationists. And obviously this happened, you know, the Japanese saw us cutting our naval spending in half, you know, and you know, at a certain point, if you were a Japanese strategist, it probably wasn't irrational to take all this data of those 10 years and basically say, yeah, the US is not going to be a direct threat to us and what we're going to do here. That was a misreading, but it wasn't irrational by the Japanese naval strategist. And of course, one of the things that happened in Japan was this shift strategically into building aircraft carriers. And this coincided with their development of, you know, really world-class, you know, planes, basically attack planes, or, you know, what eventually became torpedo bombers and fighters and fighter bombers, you know, Zeros and so on, which, you know, kind of created that strategic doctrine for them, which of course we literally had no idea about, right? We didn't, I'm not saying there were a few people in the Navy paying attention to it, but most people didn't. So
of course, Aaron, we had our own aircraft carrier development programs too. I mean, hence.
Yeah, but they didn't really.
Fleet at Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, so you're right. So, but that didn't really kick into. There was really two versions, which I'll get into. There was the 1.0. It's almost like a proof of concept carrier. They kind of look goofy. I'll show you a picture. It's basically like putting a scaffolding deck on top of a battleship or a cruiser. It actually wasn't a battleship, it was a cruiser. It was, think of taking, you know, 85% off of the top deck of a cruiser and then just putting a second deck on top of it. And then that's your aircraft carrier. So that was sort of our 1.0. And then we built what became the real aircraft carriers after that, the Lexington and the Enterprise, et cetera.
Yeah, but so, hence the surprise of Pearl Harbor. But the reason why it shouldn't have, in a way, been a surprise, because the Japanese picked Pearl Harbor because they felt they had to knock out our fleet there so that they didn't attack their flank when they went down to secure oil reserves in Malaysia.
No, you're totally right, but I think that's one of those. It's back to sort of agility, right? If you're an agile thinker, you know, 360-degree dynamic thinker, and you're taking all the scenarios in, and then you're prioritizing them, and you know, like you're trying to do this non-biased sort of view of strategy, then you're totally right. I think conventional doctrine was that the Japanese, to take over the East Pacific, are going to have to go through the Philippines. That's why we had MacArthur there. That's why we were reinforcing it sort of gradually and gracefully, sort of, you know, on the sly. You know, what we would do is we played this game that is almost, we've done this in most of our history, actually. Civil War, we even did this. There's a concept called a stop loss, which basically means, let's say your date of leaving an area, wherever you're stationed is June 1st, and someone else is supposed to rotate in, whatever, May 1st, and then you have a little transition. Then they stop loss you for 60, 90 days or 120 days, whatever. So we started playing this stop loss game in the Philippines for people that were not going to get out of the service. So if you were still going to be in the service another year or two, we would just stop loss you there. Well, so we were basically building up forces in the Philippines. But that wasn't in 36, 37. Right? That was more like 40, 41. But so we created these plans, right? We had they were all part of what were called rainbow plans. They're pretty fascinating, actually, to sort of understand, because that was our true doctrinal thinking in the world. And during the Cold War, we transitioned this to be called OPLANs, and we created a couple hundred of them. They're basically contingency plans for like almost anything that could happen anywhere in the world. And so the War Plan Orange was a U.S. and Japanese war in the Pacific. The goal was to attempt to hold the Philippines and reinforce it, build our naval forces up in Hawaii. So that presumed that we could, that Hawaii was never going to be under threat. And some of this had to do with the idea that you were going to, remember, this was the conventional thinking. The idea that you were going to sail a large Navy, non-aircraft carrier driven Navy, which has people don't realize, a non-aircraft carrier driven Navy back then had huge fuel requirements because capital ships just take enormous amount of resources. Aircraft carriers really don't, back then, they didn't really take the same type of resources. And more importantly, typically you surround your aircraft carrier with, let's say a co-equal number of cruisers, maybe 1.5 times, and a ton of destroyers and destroyer escorts, which are very small requirements in terms of resources. So the conventional thinking was, there's no way the Japanese are going to sail thousands of miles. They have no fuel stations. They're already under pressure with fuel requirements. Attack Hawaii and then somehow turn around and get back, right? It just, people viewed this as sort of space war, right? It just didn't seem likely. And then, of course, we talked about before the Mahanian sort of thinking of the goal was to defeat the Japanese Navy in a fleet engagement. So, and then to recapture the Philippines if we needed to recapture it, and have large amphibious operations to capture naval bases, and then threaten the home islands. In a lot of ways, outside of Pearl Harbor, the majority of what we planned in Orange kind of played its way out. So our conventional thinking wasn't off by too much, but where it was off in a big way. You could argue very similar to 9/11, right? When you have these sort of completely asymmetrical approaches that an enemy might take, that you can't imagine, and you have none of the tooling, even if you did imagine it, right? You didn't have the training and infrastructure and right. It's not the movies where somebody says, oh, we need to stop this. Yeah, let's stop it, right? Like push a button and it stops, right? I mean, this is like an institutional doctrine change to be prepared to defend Hawaii. Air defenses, advanced radar, ultimately putting up basically radar vessels. That was the after action analysis of it. Basically said we should have had basically, old generation submarines, 50 to 100 to 300 miles out, that would just be cycling people on it. And, basically like a remote radar station. Which that makes sense after it, but beforehand that just didn't make sense to them. So this was sort of the larger plan. This was the fleet going into 1940, right? So these were the newer generation aircraft carriers that we had just minted, basically, in basically 38, 39, 40. So we had 7 carriers, and obviously none of them were at Pearl Harbor. And when we go into the actual attack at Pearl Harbor, you'll see that was one of their number one missions, right? Their priorities. They wanted to sink, but still, the Japanese still had this strange view of sort of the optics and the imagery of power. Their number one priority was sinking at least 1, if not 2 battleships, or all of them, because they felt that would be this just devastating sort of hit on our national psyche, which they were basically projecting Japanese feelings about what that would feel like to them if they had, 5 or 10 of their big battleships sunk. And so that was sort of like the political, social objective, right? That one was more like, a national imagery objective. And then the strategic one that the strategic naval planners is they wanted to light up all our carriers, obviously. That was critical. And our cruisers. They actually feared our cruisers a lot more. We kind of one of these weird underreported or sort of, not fully understood isms of World War II. We built basically the most efficient cruisers in history, right? They were sub battleship in terms of fleet power, in terms of their big guns. But they had just enough armor. They were incredibly maneuverable. And they were truly like an innovation. I mean, they were just like really an innovation. And then we standardized them, right? So battleships are really hard to standardize. I mean, they're just so damn big. And so it's just everything about them is just big and nasty. And it doesn't matter where you are, Japan, Germany, us, England. I mean, it's just, it's just battleships are, which is why battleships in some way were primed to be overtaken, right? Whether it was aircraft carriers or far more maneuverable, which is what I argue a lot of people have, is that let's pretend aircraft carriers just didn't work out. We were not going to have big battleship fighting in World War II. It was going to go down to these far more nimble, like mini fleets with, a dozen, 20 cruisers and 60 destroyers, right? At a certain point, it just gets like, how do you sink all that, right? It just gets too hard to deal with all that, right? And especially if you don't have carriers. So, or for whatever reason, let's say carriers just didn't work out, or we weren't ready, technically for them.
So are you sort of saying, Aaron, that when we were assessing, what direction the Navy, because we knew that the Japanese were going somewhere, they were going to attack, that we thought the Pearl Harbor scenario would be them trying to float over battleships and attacking us with land guns.
Yep, exactly.
Rather than recognizing that they were going to use aircraft carriers and do air attack.
Well, yeah. So what you have to realize is the idea of aircraft carriers in any sustained conflict had never been proven yet. And then the idea that, it goes back to this sort of go to the moon, go to the Mars thing, and then fight the bad guys there too, right? Like if you can just get there, that's amazing. The idea you're going to run around and have a war on the moon just sounds, ridiculous, right? People, you can land. I remember I read this thing a week ago. It's just pretty awesome. One of the reasons we're never going to be able to be on the moon, at least until we invent some new technology, is the amount of UV rays are 200 times what you have here on Earth. You need to be 30 inches under moon dirt to basically not die of radiation poisoning over time, and, skin cancer, whatever. And so the idea that you were going to float this concept, of new warfare, new naval warfare, and you were going to attack from planes and have such a large attack that you could do the damage. remember how big our Navy was in Pearl Harbor, right? So we had, Battleship Row had 8-10 battleships. You had, half a dozen carriers, a couple dozens of cruisers, another 100. I mean, it was just so massive. So the idea that you would somehow have enough of these carriers, be able to fly enough planes, and obviously you have to do it you weren't going to have continuous waves, right? Because eventually you could have aircraft. You could either get your ships out or you could mount air defenses. It just seemed like it just didn't make sense. Now there were a handful of people, more junior mid-level officers, like there almost always are, who sort of gamed it out, but they still couldn't really put it together.
So Japan didn't send in the Pearl Harbor task force, they didn't have any battleships. It was just...
so yeah, and we'll get to that. So
okay.
So in a weird way, what the Japanese did, it's really...
Aaron, can I just say one point? I apologize.
Yeah, go ahead.
Today is, a Jewish holiday.
Yes.
And you guys stay on because you have control. You have control.
Yeah.
But in about a couple of minutes, I got to log out.
Yep, that's fine.
Because we have to fast.
Yep.
And the Hag Shemaya to everybody. And I just wanted to remind everybody that on Wednesday, I know this was a short notice, but we're doing a Q&A session, and John Maloney was gracious enough to host it on Hitler's rising to power at 7 p.m. So please join if you have a moment. And then next week we're doing the Thermopylae, which is the second battle for the Greek versus Persians. And you guys continue a non-issue, and I will log out. I apologize.
Well, yeah, and you have the recording, right?
No, it will just automatically record into the cloud. So
gotcha. Okay, good.
And then I'll upload this right after you.
No, I'll finish this. I have two slides left for this section, and then we'll pick it up, next month with the remaining. At this point, we're going to Pearl, right? Like it's happening. Trust me. I know it's been a lot of build up there, but
all right. Have a nice the rest of the. All right, no problem. And great job, Aaron, by the way, as usual. And always exceeding your previous one. I don't know if it's possible, but you always do. So I'm out. I'm out, guys. All right.
Well, once you get barreled into these things, you just the old saying, once you're in a hole, you either stop digging or you dig deeper, right? So I just figured I'd dig deeper. As we prepared for war, so one thing about FDR is he was. People forget he was a naval guy, right? I mean, he was Secretary of Navy before he was president. I mean, so he wasn't somebody who was who kind of outsourced the Navy. If anything, he at times would get a little too involved before the war. Well, once the war got going and Admiral King and Nimitz and so on, I mean, they sort of, I'm not going to say put him in his place. That's not fair, but it was pretty clear, who was in charge of the Navy and who wasn't. But beforehand, because he was so involved in the politics of it, right, the financing and the games, this senator from Washington, let's basically hide a cruiser there that we're going to just build halfway to completion because it doesn't count because it isn't, you haven't put the top deck on. I mean, he had all these, he was that active. So we built another plan called Rainbow 2, which was a far more technical plan, and this one was our real core plan, which was basically keep our fleet as a deterrent to Japan. So this is doubling down on Pearl. We were going to refuse to send forces to Singapore because we basically felt that going into World War II, Singapore was just, if and when it was overtaken by the Japanese, it turns into almost an impossible invasion at that point in time. So we were not going to support the English in this. Great Britain, sorry. And I use English like it's the Middle Ages. Sorry about that. And we were going to shift our strategy to the Atlantic first, right? Which was, and recognize at that point, right? I mean, you had the German Navy, was really at that point the most destructive thing in the water in the world, right? I mean, you had, you know, a submarine force that was awesome at that point, right? And you know, and it was strategic, it was dynamic, it was innovative, you know, and so and it was, and the key was they were incredibly rational in how they approached sinking any type of merchant shipping, right? They understand kind of like the logistics train, basically. And so we viewed that if we had to deal with a force at that point, it was going to be obviously the German Navy. And then we were going to have to support, obviously, any type of big Atlantic offensive operations and just be defensive in the Pacific, right? That was our idea. Like if let's say Japan, now you could say objectively, that never really made any sense because there was going to be a moment where, let's pretend the Japanese still don't hit us at Pearl Harbor, they invade the Philippines, right? At the end of the day, they're still invading the Philippines, taking, you know, 100,000 POWs, killing tens of thousands of Americans. I mean, we were going to have to respond at some level. So at a certain point, in some ways, we were almost trying to trick ourselves into not recognizing in the end, if and when the Japanese flipped that switch, we were going to have a co-equal two-front war. But realize, like in the United States, and not just amongst isolationists, I mean, just amongst, you know, the war planners and the people thinking this way, the idea of fighting a two-front war, right? Everyone had read, you know, from the time they were in grade school, you know, Napoleon, and it's just like, you just don't fight two-front wars, right? It was like a true heuristic, right? It was just, you don't try to do it. And so that really obviously impacted everyone's thinking on that. And then, as we talked earlier, these were, a lot of the developments, the embargo on the aviation fuel. Japan joins the Axis. Japan signs the 5-year neutrality treaty with Russia. And we talked about why, which, one of my favorite but actually one of the more important, probably one of the most important events in World War II. I always butcher it. Is it Gul Klunken? Is that it? Or Mikkel would correct me if I'm wrong. The Battle of Gul Klunken, is that it?
Halkin Goal.
Oh, that's it. Sorry. Hunkin Goal. Sorry, I had it backwards. And I butchered it too. And we'll talk about that. So that impacted everything in World War II from the Japanese perspective, because they felt if they generally believed they weren't going to fight the Soviets, or at least let's say 75%, they could focus all their energy on cleaning out the non-U.S. allies and then obviously dealing with the U.S. They in June of 41, I mean, think of how many of these events were happening. I mean, this is just, the scale and pace of this was incredible. So, Japan forced the French to turn over all their bases in South Indochina, which at that point, obviously the French were the Vichy. U.S. freezes all their assets. You had in October, the Tojo War Party takes political control. See, this is one thing we didn't fully appreciate back then, right? We kind of saw them as a continuation. We didn't really know how to read, and I mean, I'm sure we had experts, but we just didn't know how to listen and understand this. But these sort of political developments in Japan, which I know we talked about a month or two ago, were absolutely essential, right? Because even though Tojo and the War Party were the dominant influence, and you could say provisionally had control in Japan, they didn't have end-to-end, I mean, like control every institution, basically, right? I mean, almost like Soviet-like control. That happened, that fall, and we just didn't pick up on it. Like it just seemed like another, like the craziness of Japan's politics, right? It just seemed like it was a continuation.
I think that's right, Aaron, although I think there was an awareness that this was a much more militarist turn of events politically. And of course, on November 5, within days,
Yep.
What's his name, Yamamoto, or I get the names confused,
Yeah.
promulgated the Pearl Harbor attack plan.
That's right. That's right. No, you're just
November 5.
That's right.
Yeah.
So one last piece. So this is the fleet of 1937, basically, amount of Marines and naval officers, battleships, carriers. This is 37. So by 40, 41, we had 7 carriers, but 27 heavy and light cruisers, 196 destroyers, but they were like a mess, right? Going back to World War I, almost gunboats, and it was a sort of a train wreck, to be honest. It was improving. It was definitely improving compared to 33, but it just compared to the Japanese, and more importantly compared to the doctrine the Japanese had, right? So they had the doctrine, they had and then the strategic disposition.
That was our fleet in the Pacific.
No, this was the whole U.S. fleet.
The whole U.S. fleet. Wow.
Period. That was all we had, and of course, as I said earlier, we were focused on the Atlantic, right? Because we knew the Germans had proven themselves in the submarines that they were going to blow everything out of water they could, and they had this wolf pack. Basically, it was like ocean blitzkrieg model, right? So we viewed the disposition as being more focused in the Atlantic anyways. So when you really boil it down, in some ways we had a Pearl fleet as a strategic signal to the Japanese, not so much as a fleet that was going to sail hard into the East Pacific. And I think the Japanese knew that too, right? So,
sorry. Aaron?
Yep.
On the slide before, you mentioned, or you list 3 carriers.
Yes.
But in another slide before, you listed 7 carriers.
Yeah, so this is 37. So 37, we had 3 carriers, and then we basically built one a year, additional one a year.
Okay.
Modern carrier, basically through 40. So, and they were so these 3 carriers are sort of the carrier 1.0s, which I have a picture here somewhere. Yeah, carrier 1.0, Collier conversion aircraft carrier, the one you can build at home with a DIY kit. So these were carrier 1.0s. You could see the planes, right? It's very World War 1.5. But this was us figuring it out, taking basically a light cruiser to a regular cruiser, and not finishing a top deck and then putting a flight deck on top of it, right? So the first 3 carriers were these, and then the next or in essence the next 7 became modern carriers, right?
Aaron, you may be right, but in terms of the numbers, Langley, which is the one you're showing, that's CV1. CV2, I think, is Saratoga. No, CV2 is Lexington. CV3 is
yes. But understand that's So these are the actual modern carriers of the CVs, right? The CV 1 through 7, whereas this Collier was basically our CV0. If you want to call one this, right? This was the one to prove that you just wouldn't, literally, it wouldn't just like capsize, right? That it wouldn't just, hit a wave and fall over, or a plane wouldn't just fly off its deck, right? You don't see a lot of barriers here, right? If you're not a really good pilot, you might run some challenges. So, so the Langley was the first real carrier, modern carrier. And this is, it's not complete here, but this is it under its seaworthiness development, where you start to see the real length and the real structure to the superstructure to the carrier. General Lejeune, who he's one of the, you could argue he's the inventor of the modern Marine Corps. He was a commandant in the 20s. So his goal, he was an absolute strategic genius. He saw eventually that if and when we were he viewed the Marines fighting in Europe as the Army as sort of this one-off, You know, you could almost argue very similar to the Iraq War, where, you know, we brought Marines in, you know, 500 miles, you know, fighting, you know, large scale land conflicts. You know, he viewed the Marines' role at highly selectively and strategically and surgically. Its job was to be able to be this shock force. And then he added this whole amphibious capability to it. So he created another major. We talked before, it's all these majors that always have all this great thinking, right? The key, if you want to be a great thinker, there's an old joke, right? They're called iron majors, right? You want to be a great thinker in the military, just don't get promoted past major, and all you can do is think all the time, right? About how you never got promoted. That's like this old joke. So Major Pete Ellis, he basically designed what became War Plan Orange from a Marine perspective. And he was killed in Peleliu in 23. But he laid out just, I mean, when you read it today, it's just, I mean, people link it directly to modern amphibious. It is modern amphibious doctrine, right? It's the same theory that, you know, von Clausewitz would have, or, you know, it's that universal. It's basically this sort of soup to nuts approach on how you will scale and leapfrog amphibious landings and control island groups to be able to build, basically to use these island groups really as flight and re-landing platforms continuously, which is literally exactly what we did in World War II. I mean, we followed 90% of Commandant Lejeune, and more importantly, Major Ellis's plan, basically, as our doctrine. So we pulled this out and just rolled with it.
Real quick, Aaron, how well did MacArthur go down with the development of the Marines as an almost Army adjunct to the Navy?
Not very well. That would be the sort of generic way to put it. Look, there was, at the end of the day, there was a begrudging realization that, because, and we'll cover this next time because we'll finish here, but because this is sort of like, is the great wrapper on the whole conversation about us being isolationist and sort of, you know, we don't really want to do these things somewhere else. But to answer your question, Major Ellis predicted somewhere between 30 and 60 island landings if the Japanese did a sort of conquer Asia strategy. In the end, we did 78. So, and he said this, you know, 20 years earlier. And there was a realization that the Marines, the U.S. Marines, are the only force in history that's had this capacity to do this continuous amphibious landing doctrine at a scale that is, you know, it's almost ridiculous, right? It's like doing one every week or two or three, right? I mean, it's just, you know, and in the modern world, including to today, I mean, it's just not something anyone's been able to sort of replicate, right? And it speaks to sort of, you know, I would say lucky that we had these sort of the right people at the right time in the 20s. And that's the key. We had them in the 20s after World War I, so they had all this experience, but they made the pivot to not wanting to be a land force, right? That was the key. And then going down this new doctrinal path, all before the Depression. So even when the Depression hit, and there's an old saying Marines have, and it goes back to budgeting during the Depression, when somebody, I think it was one of, I forgot who it was one of the early Secretary of, you know, Treasury type budget people that was focused on the military and the Navy budget, came to, you know, the Marine Corps and said, you know, we're really sorry. It's the Depression. We have to cut the budget. And the guy said, well, what do you mean? We're used to never having anything and getting any money anyway. So we're always in a depression. And that sort of was the Marine thinking, which to this day still operates, right? Most people don't realize that, except in the newest phase the last, let's say 10 years to 15 years, the majority of the hardware the Marines have ever acquired, including during the Cold War, unless it was very mission specific, is basically leftovers from the Army and the Air Force, right? And it's really been that way. That's part of its innovation, right? It can just take other people's stuff, glue it together, and then just say, all right, that'll work. That's good enough. And we'll get into that as we go into all the island campaigns, because they basically built this, it's called an MTO, but don't worry about that. Basically, they built this deployment kit that's so basic, but it's highly scalable. And they just had all these sort of laminated cards that said, if you're missing a front door on a landing craft, you can take the front door off of this vehicle, and or you can take the hood off of this vehicle, off of this 2.5-ton truck, put it in, right? I mean, it was just like all this crazy stuff, which was their operational culture. And that was, I think, and MacArthur didn't, I mean, it wasn't just MacArthur. The Army's not built to do that, right? The Army's very slow. The Army's like an aircraft carrier. It's very slow, takes a long time to turn. And once it turns, it goes hard in that direction. The Army's not nimble like that. And especially in World War II, where we had a 90 division Army, and it just was not built to be that dynamic. But so to finish this, and hopefully, did that answer your question? I hope.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As always. Thank you.
Sure. So, this speaks to sort of, there was an impracticality of War Plan Orange because he had all these smart people, like you always have in anything in life. And then you have the impracticality of the political world and what you could really get done, which was 10% of that. More importantly, we lacked forward operating bases, real ones. We had possessions, but they were not stood up in any way that you were going to have, the kind of operating bases you needed to sort of project power. You had all these remember the same way the Japanese had conflicts between the Army and the Navy. You could argue the US had almost, in a weird way, more conflicts because, back then, remember, the Air Force was in the Army. So you had the Army Air Corps, you had the Army, the Land Army, they were in conflict. You had the Navy, you had the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps wanted their own flying capabilities. The Navy didn't want them to have that because they didn't want the Marines to have planes, and the Navy did not have planes. But the Navy really didn't want to have a lot of planes except for scouting and kind of coastal defense. So it was just this, global matrix pissing contest between all these branches. Obviously, our European first commitments, our fleet was incredibly divided, as we saw earlier. It wasn't a very big fleet either. And then we were just starting this sort of reconciliation to these rainbow war plans, which we can work into. And then we'll obviously more importantly talk about how the Japanese, set themselves up for not just Pearl Harbor, but the first 90 days. You could argue the first 90 days of Japanese strikes across the Pacific are as significant of a 90-day campaign as in history. I mean, it really is. Now, you can make a very fair argument that it wasn't sustainable. That's definitely fair. But it was that significant. I mean, they hit everything. I mean, and they took over basically everything they went after. So, and we'll get into that, as we go forward. So anyways, I'll wrap it up. Sorry for those of you that are, your high holidays or want to watch football or just want to cook dinner or anything else in between. But hopefully this was good and it gave you some sense of where we're going into the actual fighting of World War II or the rest of the fighting, because Japanese were already fighting in Manchuria and China and starting their conflicts in the rest of the East Pacific.
Totally awesome, Aaron. Unbelievable. Really great. Thank you.
Good. No,
Thanks, Aaron.
Absolutely. So everybody stay safe and look forward to the next iteration. And then if you guys want to do one like John, like you've had, or maybe John and I or Ralph or somebody else would like to do one, one thing we could do, Ralph, that could be interesting at some point. So I've always wanted to do a session on, sort of the, so the U.S. and Great Britain had the most women in World War II. The Canadians had a lot too, but in terms of raw numbers, the U.S. had, it was millions, and just all the different disposition that they had, right? It was across really almost every theater we were in. They had they were a big part of of once we got going in the Pacific by 43, 44, 45, actually. So I don't know if that's something you might be interested in, because I know, Ralph, you studied a lot of women's suffrage movement, and I don't know if you studied anything associated with women in World War II, or anyone else did. So if you want to do that, Ralph. I don't want to volunteer you, but if that's something you'd be interested in, or anyone else. But I appreciate it. I hope this was good, and you guys got something out of it, and look forward to the next session. And
Sounds good. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. Everyone join John on Wednesday. I'm sorry?
We got a lot.
Okay, good. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Aaron. Great.
Everyone stay safe. Everyone stay safe. Thanks. Bye-bye.
You too, Eric. Bye-bye.